I am Dominique, 35 years old, and a forensic accountant by trade. I came straight from the cemetery where I just buried Julian, my husband of 4 years, holding the keys to his Porsche and the deeds to 3 luxury properties. I walked into my parents' house seeking comfort, but stopped dead in my tracks in the hallway. My white brother-in-law was laughing in the living room, bragging about an old will from 2018 that he was going to use to leave me homeless and penniless. My own mother chimed in, saying it was exactly what I deserved. What they did not know was that I had the ultimate proof to destroy their entire fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family that tried to destroy you. The heavy oak front door of my parents' sprawling Atlanta estate had always been unlocked on Sundays. I pushed it open silently, escaping the cold drizzle of the afternoon. My black funeral dress was damp, and my chest was hollow with the fresh grief of losing Julian to a sudden heart attack at just 42. The rain had been pouring relentlessly at the cemetery just 2 hours ago. I stood there in the mud watching them lower my husband into the ground, my heart shattered into a million jagged pieces. Julian was my rock, a brilliant self-made real estate developer who saw past my family's toxic facade and loved me for my sharp mind and relentless drive. During the burial service, my father, Pastor Silas, stood at the podium, with tears streaming down his face, delivering a eulogy so moving that half the congregation was weeping. He called Julian a son, a pillar of the community, a blessing to our family. I needed my mother. I needed my father to offer some genuine words of grace to me in private. Instead, as I slipped off my wet heels in the foyer, the sound of clinking crystal glasses and raucous laughter echoed from the formal living room. I realized those tears at the cemetery were not of sorrow. They were tears of greed. I crept closer, the thick Persian runner swallowing my footsteps. Through the partially open French doors I saw them. Not mourning, celebrating. Trent, my 34-year-old white brother-in-law, was pacing in front of the fireplace, swirling amber liquor in a tumbler. Trent was a self-proclaimed crypto entrepreneur whose ventures always mysteriously collapsed, requiring my father to bail him out. Now he looked like a man who had just won the lottery. I am telling you, Silas Trent boasted, his voice dripping with arrogance. Julian dying right now is the greatest blessing this family could have asked for. I still have the original copy of his will from 2018, the one he wrote before he even met Dominique. I held my breath, the cold metal of the Porsche keys digging into my palm. My mother Vivian sat on the velvet sofa, perfectly poised, not a single hair out of place. She took a delicate sip of her wine. "Thank the Lord," she said, her tone icy. "That girl has been parading around this city like she is better than us ever since she married that real estate developer." It is time Dominique learned some humility. She thinks because she audits corporate fraud for a living, she can look down on her own blood. My younger sister Chloe draped herself over an armchair. At 32, she was the golden child, spoiled and entitled, currently wearing a diamond necklace Julian had bought me for my birthday, which she had conveniently borrowed and never returned. "So what does the will actually say, Trent?" she asked eagerly. "Do we get the Aspen house?" "Because I absolutely refuse to stay in a hotel this winter." Trent chuckled, pulling a folded document from his tailored suit jacket. A suit he bought with my father's church donations, no doubt. "It is even better, Chloe," he said. "Before Julian met your sister, he left his entire estate, all $5 million of it, to the church charity fund. And guess who he named as the executor in that old document? Me. The beauty of this plan is the absolute legality of it. Julian never updated this specific document with my lawyer. Sure, he might have told people he was leaving everything to his precious wife, but in the eyes of the probate court, paper is king. And I hold the paper. I will file the petition for probate first thing Monday morning. The court will freeze all his personal bank accounts immediately. She will not be able to buy a cup of coffee by lunchtime." Chloe clapped her hands together like a delighted toddler. "Oh, this is going to be phenomenal. Can we hire security to escort her out of the penthouse? I want to record it when they throw her designer bags onto the sidewalk. She always acted like her corporate job made her a genius. Let us see how smart she is when her credit cards decline at the grocery store. My father, the beloved Pastor Silas, nodded in solemn agreement. It is God's will, my father said smoothly. The church needs those funds. And Trent needs capital to revive his trading platform. Dominique is young. She can go rent a small apartment and start over. It will build her character. Do not be too harsh, Chloe. My mother, Vivian said, though a wicked smile betrayed her fake sympathy. We must maintain our image. When the church members ask, we will say, Dominique was too overcome with grief to manage the estate and that we stepped in to protect Julian's legacy. We are doing her a favor, really. The burden of sudden wealth would ruin a girl like her. She lacks our refined sensibilities. I might even let her rent the old storage room over the garage if she begs nicely. But only if she apologizes to Chloe for being so haughty at the Thanksgiving dinner. Listening to them, my analytical mind automatically began cataloging their mistakes. 1. They assumed Julian's assets were still tied to his personal name. 2. Trent confessed out loud to intending to misappropriate estate funds for his personal business. 3. My mother just admitted to a coordinated smear campaign to manipulate public perception. As a forensic accountant, I view the world through the lens of liability and evidence. I spend my days tracing offshore accounts, uncovering shell companies, and testifying against corporate embezzlers in federal court. I destroy white-collar criminals before breakfast. And here was my own family casually plotting a multi-million-dollar fraud in their living room, completely unaware that the grim reaper of audits was standing right outside their door. My father's deep, resonant voice broke through my thoughts. We must move quickly and quietly, Silas instructed. Trent, ensure the paperwork is flawless. If Dominique suspects anything before the accounts are frozen, she might try to hire an attorney. We need to strike while she is still paralyzed by her grief. Right now she is weak. She is probably sitting in that empty penthouse crying her eyes out, completely defenseless. Defenseless. The word echoed in my mind. They truly thought my grief made me stupid. They thought taking away my husband meant taking away my spine. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between a grieving widow and a woman with nothing left to lose. I looked down at my hands. I was holding the deeds to the 3 commercial properties Julian and I had purchased last year, properties that were fully secured and completely out of Trent's pathetic reach. I was holding the keys to a life they could only dream of stealing. The tears that had been threatening to fall since the funeral dried up, instantly replaced by a cold, burning anger. I did not want to cry anymore. I wanted to see them burn. I wanted to watch their pristine, carefully curated world crumble into ash. I uncurled my fists. I rolled my shoulders back, letting the posture of the terrified daughter fall away, and standing tall as the woman Julian loved. A woman who dealt in hard facts and ruthless consequences. I took one final silent breath, letting the icy resolve settle deep into my bones. Then I stepped out of the shadows, raised both hands, and pushed the heavy French doors wide open. The heavy oak doors slammed against the walls with a loud, violent crack. The sudden noise shattered the celebratory atmosphere in the living room, like a brick through a stained glass window. Trent froze instantly. His glass of expensive bourbon halted halfway to his mouth. My mother gasped, her hand flying instinctively to her pearl necklace, as if I had just walked in holding a weapon. Chloe let out a startled squeak and practically dived over the armrest of the velvet sofa, desperately shoving the folded document she had been holding under a decorative throw pillow. I walked into the center of the room, my black heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of rich mahogany, expensive liquor, and cheap betrayal. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stopped right in front of the glass coffee table, looking down at the 4 people who were supposed to be my support system on the darkest day of my life. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I raised my hand and tossed Julian's heavy Porsche keys onto the glass. The metallic clatter echoed in the silent room, making Trent flinch visibly. Are we having a real estate auction, Or are we just picking through my dead husband's pockets before the dirt on his grave has even settled? I asked. My voice was dangerously low, stripped of any warmth or familial affection. I kept my posture completely rigid. I was just at the cemetery. His body is not even cold yet. The rain is still washing the mud off his headstone, and you are sitting in here dividing up his assets like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Chloe was the first to recover. She sat up straight, awkwardly trying to smooth her hair and mask her sheer panic with a mask of forced indignation. "Dominique, please do not be so dramatic," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward Trent. "We were just discussing logistics. You know how incredibly stressful funerals are for the family. Trent was just trying to help figure out the legal side of things so you do not have to worry about the paperwork. He is just trying to protect you. Protect me." I turned my gaze entirely to Trent. Under the weight of my stare, the self-proclaimed business genius suddenly looked very small in his tailored Italian suit. The last time Trent tried to figure out the financial side of anything, he burned through $500,000 of investor money on a worthless cryptocurrency token that collapsed in exactly 3 days. And who had to bail him out to keep him from facing federal wire fraud charges? Julian did. My husband quietly wrote a massive check to cover your catastrophic failure, Trent, just to keep my sister from the public humiliation of being married to a convicted felon. You are not a businessman. You are a financial parasite playing dress-up with my father's church donations. Trent turned bright red, the veins in his neck bulging. "You do not know what you are talking about," he spat, slamming his glass down on the mantelpiece. The market was volatile. It was a liquidity issue. It was gross incompetence, I corrected him sharply. "I am a forensic accountant, Trent. I read ledgers the way other people read the morning news. I know exactly how much you owe, and I know you are desperate." Before Trent could respond, my father stepped forward to intervene. Pastor Silas cleared his throat, adjusting his gold cufflinks. He put on his best benevolent face, the one he used to charm thousands of parishioners every Sunday morning. "Now see here, Dominique. There is absolutely no need for this kind of hostility. We are family. We bear each other's burdens in times of sorrow. Your sister and your brother-in-law are simply concerned for your well-being. The Lord teaches us to be prepared for the unexpected, and Julian's passing was a tragedy none of us foresaw." "Do not dare quote scripture to me to justify your greed, Dad," I snapped, cutting him off completely. "I know exactly how this family operates, and I know exactly how this church operates. You have spent your entire career standing at a pulpit preaching about sacrifice, humility, and community, while secretly draining everyone around you to fund this fake First Family of Atlanta lifestyle." I gestured broadly around the opulent living room, pointing at the expensive art and the imported rugs. "You built this perfect, flawless image of Black excellence for your congregation, but I know the books. I know you took the college fund you promised me when I was 18 and used it to quietly pay off a massive tax lien on this very estate. I had to take out crushing student loans and work 3 jobs to get my degree because you needed to buy my mother a new Mercedes to maintain appearances for the church board. I built my career from absolute scratch. And Julian knew it. He saw right through this pristine facade from the day he met you all." My mother Vivian stood up abruptly, her face flushed with righteous anger. "How dare you speak to your father that way under his roof? We gave you everything. We gave you a respected name, a pedigree. We gave you a standard of living that most people only dream of, and you bring this disgusting disrespect into my house on the day we laid a family member to rest. Your house." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that had no humor in it. "I am standing in a house that is entirely mortgaged to its roof, Mother. Do not play the victim. I stood in that hallway for 10 minutes. I heard every single word you all said. I heard you talking about claiming the Aspen house for Chloe. I heard Trent bragging about an outdated will. You all think I am just some grieving, helpless widow who is too weak to fight back. You think because I do not wear my resume on my sleeve, because I do not boast about my salary, that I am stupid." Silence fell over the room again, heavy and suffocating. They realized I had caught them red-handed. The polite grieving daughter act was over. I was speaking to them not as family, but as an auditor, uncovering a massive corporate fraud. My father realized the guilt trip was no longer working. The gentle, benevolent patriarch routine immediately dropped away, replaced by the authoritative, commanding megachurch pastor who was used to absolute obedience from his flock. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence, and walked slowly toward me. He held out his large, heavy hand, palm up. He lowered his voice into that deep, booming baritone he used from the pulpit to force sinners into submission, aiming to intimidate me into compliance. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominique Silas said, his eyes turning hard cold and entirely unyielding. "You are clearly hysterical and completely not in your right mind right now. Your grief is clouding your judgment and making you paranoid. Julian had many complex business dealings, real estate investments, corporate accounts, partnerships that are far too complicated for a woman in your deeply emotional state to handle. You are going to make a catastrophic mistake if you try to manage this alone." He took another step closer, looming over me, pointing a finger toward my leather handbag. "You are going to open your purse right now. You are going to hand over Julian's bank cards, the keys to all of his properties, and his personal laptop. We are going to hold on to them and manage the estate for you. We will secure the assets until you are mentally stable enough to behave like a respectful daughter and a proper member of this family. Now hand them over to me. Now." My father stood there with his hand outstretched, demanding the last remnants of my husband's life. But before I could respond to his booming, authoritative command, Trent stepped out from behind him. Emboldened by my father's aggression, my brother-in-law strutted forward and waved the folded 2018 will in my face like a winning lottery ticket. You heard the Pastor Dominique Trent sneered, his chest puffed out with unearned confidence. "As the designated executor in this legally binding document, I am officially stepping in as the interim asset manager of Julian's estate. I have a fiduciary duty to secure the assets immediately to prevent any mismanagement. You are too emotional to handle the complexities of a multi-million-dollar portfolio. Hand over the items." He used corporate buzzwords with the sloppy execution of a man who had only read business magazines in a dentist waiting room. Mismanagement, fiduciary duty, interim asset manager. I knew exactly what those terms meant in a court of law. I knew the crushing, inescapable liabilities attached to assuming the role of an interim asset manager, especially when dealing with commercial real estate and corporate debts. Trent had absolutely no idea what kind of legal bear trap he was happily stepping into. Chloe moved to stand next to her husband, crossing her arms tightly. The diamonds on her neck. My diamonds caught the light from the chandelier. "You should start packing tonight," she commanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of empathy. "The penthouse is an estate asset now, and Trent needs a proper home office to manage the transition of the company. I want you out by the end of the week. You do not deserve to live in a place like that anyway. Take your cheap clothes and get out before we have to legally evict you." My mother, Vivian, nodded in agreement from the sofa, delicately crossing her legs. "Do not be stubborn, Dominique. I already told you that you can have the storage room above the garage. We will even help you move your personal items. It is time you remembered where you came from and learned to be grateful for whatever this family decides to give you." I looked at the four of them standing together. My father with his false righteousness. My mother with her toxic vanity. My sister with her petty jealousy. And Trent, the parasitic outsider who thought he had finally struck gold. If I fought them right now, if I screamed and cried and raged against the sheer injustice of it all, it would only give them what they desperately wanted. They wanted a show. They wanted to see the haughty, independent daughter finally break down and beg for their mercy. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not operate on emotion. I operate on evidence, strategy, and calculated execution. One of the fundamental rules of auditing a hostile target is to let them talk. You let them feel smart. You let them commit to their fraudulent narrative on paper, and you do not interrupt them while they are actively destroying their own defense. So I shifted my strategy. I intentionally dropped my shoulders, letting my posture slump. I let my eyes fall to the hardwood floor, effectively masking the cold calculation in my stare. I unclenched my fists and allowed my hands to tremble slightly as I gripped the strap of my purse. I made myself look exactly how they expected me to look. A defeated, shattered widow buckling under the overwhelming power of her influential family. I saw my father's posture relax into a smug stance. I saw Trent smirk in triumph. I saw Chloe practically glowing with vindicated pride. I slowly reached into my bag and pulled out the thick stack of Julian's corporate access cards. I placed them on the glass coffee table right next to the Porsche keys. I did not say a word about the commercial deeds I had firmly tucked inside the hidden lining of my purse. "You want to manage his estate, Trent?" I asked quietly, keeping my voice soft and deliberately shaky. "You want all the responsibility that comes with Julian's name and Julian's business?" "Absolutely," Trent replied quickly, snatching the access cards off the table and shoving them into his pocket before I could change my mind. "I am the only one here qualified to handle an operation of this magnitude. I will contact the bank tomorrow to formally assume control of the ledgers. You just focus on packing your bags." I turned away from them and walked slowly toward the heavy oak doors. I paused with my hand resting on the cold brass handle. I did not look back. I did not need to see their faces again to know they were already celebrating my surrender. "Fine," I said. The artificial tremble in my voice vanished instantly, replaced by a dead icy calm that made the word ring through the room like a gunshot. "Take whatever you think is yours, but do not come crying to me when the ledger balances." I walked out of the house and stepped back into the freezing Atlanta rain. I did not look back as I ordered a rideshare from my phone, leaving Julian's pristine Porsche in their driveway as the perfect shiny bait. Let Trent drive it. Let him feel like a king for a few days. The higher he climbed onto his imaginary throne, the harder the concrete was going to feel when I ripped the floor out from under him. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. The city lights blurred against the wet windows of the car, but my mind was incredibly clear. When I finally unlocked the door to my home, the heavy silence of the empty space hit me. The faint scent of Julian's cedar and black pepper cologne still lingered in the air of the foyer. For a brief second, the overwhelming grief threatened to pull me under again, but I pushed it down. I had a job to do. I walked straight past the dark, empty living room and headed directly into Julian's massive home office. The room was lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves filled with architectural texts and real estate law volumes. I walked over to the third bookshelf on the right wall. I pulled out a heavy copy of a tax code encyclopedia, revealing a sleek biometric wall safe hidden seamlessly behind the dark wood paneling. Julian had installed this safe 3 years ago. Only he and I had access to it. I pressed my thumb against the glowing green scanner. The machine beeped softly, and the heavy steel door clicked open with a satisfying clunk. Inside, past the stacks of emergency cash and our secondary passports, sat a thick manila envelope. It was not a standard file. It was secured with heavy red tamper-evident tape and bore the embossed stamp of one of the most ruthless and expensive estate law firms in the state of Georgia. I carefully pulled the heavy envelope out of the safe and carried it over to the large oak desk. I sat in Julian's leather chair, turned on the brass reading lamp, and stared at the red seal. Trent thought he held the ultimate weapon with a flimsy, outdated will from 2018. He thought probate court would be a walk in the park. I broke the red seal and slid the crisp, heavy parchment documents onto the desk. The bold black letters at the top of the first page reflected in the lamplight. The Julian Washington Irrevocable Living Trust. I ran my fingers over my husband's sharp, familiar signature at the bottom of the page, dated precisely 2 years ago. I smiled a cold, predatory smile in the quiet darkness of the office. Let them freeze the bank accounts. Let them file their pathetic petition for probate. They were about to find out that Julian Washington did not own a single asset in his personal name, and they had just declared war on the sole trustee. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in the sterile glass-walled conference room of an overpriced law firm in downtown Atlanta. Trent had spared no expense, likely using the very church funds he was supposed to be managing to hire a bulldog attorney who specialized in aggressive estate litigation. The lawyer sat across from me, a smug man wearing a suit that cost more than my first car. My entire family was arranged around the long mahogany table like a royal tribunal preparing to pass a sentence on a peasant. My father, Pastor Silas, sat with his hands folded piously over his stomach. My mother, Vivian, was busy adjusting her designer silk scarf, refusing to even make eye contact with me. Chloe sat next to Trent, tapping her freshly manicured nails against the polished wood, practically vibrating with excitement. And Trent, sitting at the head of the table as if he had just conquered a small nation, wore an arrogant smirk that made my blood run cold. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Mrs. Washington," he began, using my married name with a distinct tone of condescension. "We called you here today to formally notify you that we have officially filed the petition for probate regarding your late husband's estate. The court has recognized the 2018 will as the active document." He tapped a stack of crisp papers resting between us. "As per the stipulations of this document, the entirety of Julian Washington's liquid assets, his business holdings, and all real estate properties, including your current primary residence, are to be immediately transferred into the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund. Furthermore, your brother-in-law Trent has been legally appointed as the executor and interim asset manager." I kept my face completely blank. As a forensic accountant, I had sat across the table from corporate embezzlers, tax evaders, and corrupt CEOs. I knew how to control my micro-expressions. I knew that the slightest flinch would give them the satisfaction they were desperately craving. The lawyer slid a single legally binding document across the polished mahogany table. He placed a heavy gold pen directly on top of it. "This is a waiver of contest," the lawyer explained smoothly. "By signing this, you agree not to challenge the validity of the 2018 will in probate court. It is a standard procedure. Frankly, considering you have no legal standing and no alternative documentation fighting, this would only drain you financially. We are offering you a clean break. Sign the waiver, hand over the remaining keys, and the family will agree not to pursue you for the legal fees associated with this transition." I stared down at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation designed to terrify a grieving widow into surrendering her rights before she even had a chance to understand them. But I was not a helpless widow. I was the sole trustee of an irrevocable living trust that rendered every single piece of paper in this room completely worthless. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in the uncomfortable tension. My mother finally broke the quiet. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You need to sign it, Dominique. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You have always been far too prideful for your own good. Living in that multi-million-dollar penthouse gave you severe delusions of grandeur." She offered a tight, artificial smile. "This is a blessing in disguise. Moving out of that luxury building and finding a small apartment in one of the lower-income neighborhoods on the South Side will build your character. It will teach you the humility you so desperately lack. You can finally experience how normal people live instead of looking down on your own family from your ivory tower." Chloe chimed in, unable to hide her glee. "And you really need to be out by Friday. Trent has contractors coming to measure the penthouse for renovations. We are turning your dressing room into a home gym." I looked at my sister. The sheer audacity of her greed was almost impressive. They were entirely convinced that they had won. They thought the law was a weapon that only they knew how to wield. But I knew the truth. I knew that by formally filing that outdated will and legally claiming control of Julian's estate, Trent had just made himself personally liable for any and all financial discrepancies attached to the church's charity fund. He had blindly walked into a federal trap, and all I had to do was lock the cage. I could have pulled the trust documents out of my bag right then and there. I could have slammed them onto the table, humiliated the lawyer, and watched my family's smug faces shatter into absolute panic. But that would be too easy. That would just be a legal victory. I wanted total, irreversible destruction. I needed time to complete my forensic audit of Trent's offshore crypto accounts. I needed the FBI to finish processing the wire fraud evidence I was quietly compiling. So I played my part. I intentionally let my breathing become shallow. I allowed my hands to tremble visibly as I reached out and touched the edge of the waiver. I looked up at the lawyer, widening my eyes to feign overwhelming panic. "I cannot sign this right now," I whispered, making my voice crack perfectly. "I do not understand all of this legal jargon. You are asking me to sign away my entire life. I need time. Just give me 1 week. Let me find a lawyer to explain this to me properly. If it is as ironclad as you say, then 1 week will not change anything." My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if I were a misbehaving toddler exhausting his patience. "Dominique, you are being unreasonable. We are trying to handle this internally to save you from public embarrassment." But Trent held up his hand, silencing my father. Trent looked at my trembling hands, completely buying the performance. The illusion of absolute power had thoroughly blinded him. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and offered me a chilling, triumphant sneer. "Let her have a week," Silas Trent said arrogantly. "If she wants to waste whatever little savings she has left on a consultation fee, let her. No lawyer in Atlanta is going to touch a case against this firm when we hold the original will." Trent leaned forward, locking eyes with me. "You have exactly 7 days, Dominique. Next Friday is the church's annual charity gala. I will be taking the stage to formally announce my new position as the head of Julian's company. If this paper is not signed by then, I will instruct the legal team to forcefully evict you, and I will freeze your personal checking accounts for suspected commingling of estate funds." I lowered my head, hiding the cold, predatory smile that was threatening to break across my face. "Thank you, Trent," I murmured softly. "1 week is all I need." The lawyer nodded sharply, seemingly satisfied with my temporary submission. He began gathering his thick stacks of paper, sliding them back into his expensive leather briefcase. The tension in the room dipped slightly as my mother let out a dramatic sigh of relief, and my father offered a quiet, theatrical praise to the heavens. It appeared the ambush was over. I shifted in my seat, preparing to stand and leave them to their premature victory celebration. "Hold on," Trent said abruptly, his voice sliced through the settling atmosphere. "We are not quite finished here." The lawyer paused, looking at Trent with a hint of mild surprise. Trent ignored him. He reached into his sleek, undoubtedly brand-new leather portfolio and pulled out a single, neatly pressed document. He did not ask his expensive lawyer to present it. He wanted to do this himself. He wanted to wield the power with his own 2 hands, desperate to prove that he was the absolute alpha of the room. Trent slid the paper across the polished mahogany table until it rested directly in front of me. The heading at the top was printed in bold, aggressive letters: "Declaration of Interim Asset Management and Fiduciary Assumption." "I am granting you a week of grace to review the waiver," Trent said, leaning back and steepling his fingers together in a practiced pose he had probably seen in a movie about Wall Street. But a week is a long time in the business world. I cannot have Julian's companies sitting idle, and I certainly cannot risk you logging into the corporate accounts out of spite and moving capital around. He tapped his index finger against the table, his eyes locked onto mine with a predatory gleam. Therefore, I had my personal corporate team draft this declaration. It officially recognizes my immediate, uncontested authority as the sole interim manager of Julian's entire portfolio, effectively integrating his business operations with the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund as of today. I need you to sign the acknowledgement of receipt and consent at the bottom. It simply states that you recognize my authority and will not interfere with my management during your 1 week grace period. My father nodded approvingly. "It is a necessary precaution, Dominique. We must protect the church's new assets from any emotional decisions you might make." I looked down at the paper. On the surface, it looked exactly like what Trent claimed it was, a standard corporate power play designed to humiliate me and strip away my remaining dignity. It was a gag order and a surrender document rolled into one. But I am a forensic accountant. I do not read documents like a normal person. I read them like a predator scanning a dark forest for a tripwire. My eyes bypassed the intimidating bold headings and the aggressive introductory paragraphs, scanning straight down to the dense, heavily worded clauses hidden in the middle of the page. The fine print. The place where corporate criminals usually bury their bodies. It only took me 5 seconds to find it. Paragraph 4, subsection B. The text read that by assuming total operational control of the integrated assets, the interim asset manager assumes full unrestricted fiduciary responsibility for the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund and all associated entities. Furthermore, the manager legally absorbs all current and historical liabilities, debts, regulatory compliance obligations, and financial encumbrances attached to the fund as of the date of signing. My heart gave a sudden violent jolt against my ribs. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop my jaw from dropping. Trent had not asked the high-priced estate lawyer sitting next to him to draft this document. I could tell by the overly aggressive, bloated phrasing that Trent had either downloaded a boilerplate template from the internet or forced one of his cheap crypto lawyers to write it up quickly just so he could flex his muscles today. In his desperate, blinding rush to crown himself the king of my husband's empire, Trent had completely overlooked the legal definition of fiduciary assumption. He thought this paper just gave him the keys to the kingdom. He did not realize it also chained him to the dungeon. By signing this document and legally integrating his authority over the church charity fund, Trent was officially taking personal legal responsibility for the fund's entire financial state. He was making himself the legally binding fall guy. Trent had been quietly siphoning money out of my father's church fund to pay off his disastrous cryptocurrency debts. My father had been helping him cover it up, shifting money around to keep the church board in the dark. If the authorities ever investigated the church, it would have been a tangled web of shared blame between my father and my brother-in-law. But with this single piece of paper, Trent was stepping squarely into the line of fire alone. He was officially telling the federal government that he and he alone was responsible for the financial integrity of the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund. If millions of dollars were missing, Trent was legally declaring that he was the one holding the bag. It was the absolute holy grail of financial prosecution, and he was handing it to me on a silver platter. Well, my sister Chloe snapped, her voice dripping with irritation. Are you going to sign it, or are we going to sit here all day? I have a fitting at Neiman Marcus in an hour, and you are wasting my time. I forced my eyes to well up with fresh tears. I blinked rapidly, letting one single tear slip down my cheek. I took a shallow, shaky breath and looked up at Trent with an expression of complete defeat. Trent, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. Are you absolutely sure you want to take all of this on? Julian's business is incredibly complex. There are tax liabilities, payrolls, vendor contracts, and the church fund is massive. It is a lot of legal responsibility for one person to carry. If anything goes wrong, if the numbers do not add up, you will be the one responsible. Trent let out a sharp, mocking laugh. He looked at my father, shaking his head, as if I had just said the most foolish thing in the world. Dominique, you really need to stop pretending you understand high-level finance just because you run spreadsheets for a living, Trent sneered. I manage millions in digital assets. I understand market liquidity and corporate structures on a level Julian never even comprehended. Taking over a few real estate holdings and a charity fund is child's play for me. I welcome the responsibility. In fact, I demand it. Now stop stalling and sign the acknowledgement. My mother checked her diamond watch and sighed. Please, Dominique, stop embarrassing yourself. You lost. The least you can do is bow out with a shred of grace. Let the men handle the business. I lowered my head, hiding my face behind my hair. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the table. My fingers shook so violently that I almost dropped the pen. I took another deep, shuddering breath, playing the role of the broken, terrified widow to absolute perfection. I pressed the pen to the heavy parchment. I signed my name at the bottom of the acknowledgement, validating his declaration. The second the ink left the pen, Trent snatched the paper out from under my hand. He held it up to the light, inspecting my signature with a triumphant grin. He carefully slid the document into his leather portfolio and snapped it shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room, like a cell door locking into place. "Excellent," Trent said, buttoning his suit jacket and standing up. He looked down at me like a king observing a beggar. "You have until next Friday to sign the final waiver. Enjoy your last few days in the penthouse, Dominique. I highly suggest you start packing the cheap stuff first." My father stood up, smoothing his tie. "Let us go, family. We have a lot of preparations to make for the gala. We have to announce the future of this family's legacy." Chloe grabbed her designer bag, completely ignoring me as she chatted with my mother about her upcoming shopping trip. They all turned their backs to me, walking toward the heavy glass doors of the conference room. The lawyer gave me one last pitying glance before following them out. I remained seated at the large mahogany table. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me completely alone in the silent room. I looked down at my hands. The violent trembling stopped instantly. My fingers were perfectly steady. I slowly reached up and wiped the single fake tear off my cheek. The terrified, defeated expression melted away from my face, replaced by a cold, calculating calm. I leaned back in my chair and let out a soft, dark laugh. Trent wanted to be the interim asset manager. He wanted the title, the power, and the prestige. He wanted to sit on the throne. But what he did not know was that the throne was sitting on a mountain of federal explosives, and he had just handed me the detonator. All I needed to do now was light the match. I walked out of the glass building, the humid Atlanta air hitting my face. I did not take a cab this time. I walked the 6 blocks to my apartment, letting the rhythm of my footsteps sharpen my focus. When I swiped my key fob and entered the penthouse, I did not bother turning on the main lights. I went straight to the kitchen, brewed a pot of black coffee, and carried the steaming mug into Julian's home office. I locked the heavy oak door behind me. I sat down at the massive desk, woke up my customized dual-monitor workstation, and cracked my knuckles. The time for playing the grieving, helpless widow was officially over. It was time to go to war. As a senior forensic accountant, my laptop is a weapon. I have specialized software and access to financial databases that can strip a company down to its bare bones in a matter of hours. I opened a secure encrypted browser and began my hunt. I started with the holy grail of my father's empire, the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund. Because it was registered as a tax-exempt nonprofit organization, the church was legally required to file a Form 990 with the Internal Revenue Service every year. These public documents are supposed to show exactly where the charity money comes from and exactly where it goes. To the untrained eye, a Form 990 is just a boring maze of bureaucratic numbers. To me, it is a roadmap. I pulled the filings for the last 3 years and ran them through my data visualization software. Almost immediately, the anomalies lit up my screen like red flares in the dark. For years, my father's charity had maintained a steady, predictable burn rate, spending money on local food drives, youth scholarships, and community outreach. But exactly 8 months ago, the spending pattern fractured. I found a series of massive, undocumented outgoing wire transfers, neatly disguised under a vague ledger category labeled as urban development grants and technical consulting fees. In just 6 weeks, exactly $2 million had been drained out of the charity's main operating account. I took a sip of my black coffee, my eyes scanning the screen rapidly. $2 million does not just vanish into thin air. Money always leaves a trail. You just have to know which rocks to overturn. I isolated the routing numbers attached to those consulting fees. They led me to 3 different limited liability companies registered in the state of Delaware. Delaware is a notorious safe haven for people trying to hide corporate ownership because the state does not require you to publicly disclose the names of the executives. But criminals are lazy. They almost always use the same registered agents to set up their shell companies. I ran a cross-reference on the registered agent associated with those 3 Delaware companies. The database spit back a name and an address in downtown Atlanta. It was the exact same cheap strip mall law firm that had represented Trent during his first failed startup venture 5 years ago. A cold, triumphant smile spread across my face. I had you, Trent. I had you by the throat. I dug deeper, bypassing the public registries and tapping into the blockchain ledgers. Trent was a self-proclaimed crypto genius, which meant he left digital footprints everywhere. It took me less than 40 minutes to trace the flow of fiat currency from the Delaware shell companies directly into a series of offshore cryptocurrency wallets. Wallets that were tied directly to Apex Digital Trent's disastrous trading platform. The entire ugly picture snapped into perfect clarity. 8 months ago, the crypto market took a massive dive. Trent was over-leveraged and hit with massive margin calls from some very dangerous unregulated lenders. He was facing total bankruptcy and likely criminal charges from his angry investors. Panicking, he went to the only man who cared more about maintaining a perfect public image than following the law. My father. Pastor Silas could not let his golden family be tarnished by a bankrupt, fraudulent son-in-law. So my father authorized the transfer of $2 million in charity funds money, donated by hard-working parishioners, directly into Trent's failing business to plug the hole. But there was a ticking time bomb. The fiscal year was ending soon. The state tax board would eventually demand an audit of the charity, and they would notice the missing $2 million. My father and Trent were desperate. They needed a massive influx of clean cash to replace the stolen money before the auditors arrived. And then my brilliant, wealthy husband died of a sudden heart attack. They looked at Julian's $5 million estate and saw their salvation. They planned to use that outdated 2018 will to legally hijack Julian's assets, funnel the money into the church charity, quietly replace the stolen $2 million, and pocket the rest of the $3 million to fund Trent's next scam and my mother's shopping habits. And they planned to throw me out on the street to do it. It was a breathtakingly evil plan. And it would have worked perfectly if Julian had not put everything into a trust, and if Trent had not been arrogant enough to sign a fiduciary assumption document this morning. By signing that paper at the law firm, Trent legally declared that he alone was the managing director of the charity fund, completely absorbing all of its historical debts and liabilities. He had legally shielded my father and put his own neck directly in the federal noose. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. I downloaded the transaction hashes, the forged invoices, the Delaware registration documents, and the blockchain ledgers. I compiled everything into a massive, heavily encrypted PDF dossier. This was not just a case for probate court anymore. This was a textbook case of federal wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. I opened my secure email client and typed in the private address of a contact I had at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a senior agent I had worked with on a corporate embezzlement case 2 years ago. I attached the encrypted dossier. All I had to do was click send, and Trent's entire life would be reduced to a prison sentence. I hovered my mouse over the send button, savoring the absolute power of the moment. Then the dead silence of the penthouse was violently shattered. Boom, boom, boom. The noise echoed through the expansive hallway like a physical blow. It was coming from the heavy steel front door of the penthouse. It was not a polite knock. It was the aggressive, rhythmic pounding of a fist hammering against the metal, accompanied by the muffled, angry shouts of men in the corridor. I froze, my hand still resting on the mouse. "Open the door!" a gruff, unfamiliar voice bellowed from the hallway. "We know you are in there. Open the door, or we are going to drill the locks." My heart slammed against my ribs. It had only been a few hours since the meeting at the law firm. Trent had promised me a week to review the paperwork, but Trent was a liar and a coward. He knew I was smart, and somewhere deep down his paranoia had clearly kicked in. He was not going to wait 7 days. He had sent his hired muscle, a team of aggressive repo men, to clear me out of my own home immediately and seize Julian's physical assets before I could dig any deeper. The heavy pounding started again, louder this time, shaking the expensive artwork hanging on the foyer walls. They were trying to break the door down. The heavy oak doors slammed against the walls with a loud, violent crack. The sudden noise shattered the celebratory atmosphere in the living room like a brick through a stained glass window. Trent froze instantly. His glass of expensive bourbon halted halfway to his mouth. My mother gasped, her hand flying instinctively to her pearl necklace as if I had just walked in holding a weapon. Chloe let out a startled squeak and practically dived over the armrest of the velvet sofa, desperately shoving the folded document she had been holding under a decorative throw pillow. I walked into the center of the room, my black heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of rich mahogany, expensive liquor, and cheap betrayal. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stopped right in front of the glass coffee table, looking down at the 4 people who were supposed to be my support system on the darkest day of my life. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, I raised my hand and tossed Julian's heavy Porsche keys onto the glass. The metallic clatter echoed in the silent room, making Trent flinch visibly. Are we having a real estate auction? Or are we just picking through my dead husband's pockets before the dirt on his grave has even settled? I asked. My voice was dangerously low, stripped of any warmth or familial affection. I kept my posture completely rigid. I was just at the cemetery. His body is not even cold yet. The rain is still washing the mud off his headstone, and you are sitting in here dividing up his assets like vultures circling a fresh carcass. Chloe was the first to recover. She sat up straight, awkwardly trying to smooth her hair and mask her sheer panic with a mask of forced indignation. "Dominique, please do not be so dramatic," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward Trent. "We were just discussing logistics. You know how incredibly stressful funerals are for the family. Trent was just trying to help figure out the legal side of things so you do not have to worry about the paperwork. He is just trying to protect you." Protect me. I turned my gaze entirely to Trent. Under the weight of my stare, the self-proclaimed business genius suddenly looked very small in his tailored Italian suit. The last time Trent tried to figure out the financial side of anything, he burned through $500,000 of investor money on a worthless cryptocurrency token that collapsed in exactly 3 days. And who had to bail him out to keep him from facing federal wire fraud charges? Julian did. My husband quietly wrote a massive check to cover your catastrophic failure, Trent, just to keep my sister from the public humiliation of being married to a convicted felon. You are not a businessman. You are a financial parasite playing dress-up with my father's church donations. Trent turned bright red, the veins in his neck bulging. You do not know what you are talking about, he spat, slamming his glass down on the mantelpiece. The market was volatile. It was a liquidity issue. It was gross incompetence, I corrected him sharply. I am a forensic accountant, Trent. I read ledgers the way other people read the morning news. I know exactly how much you owe, and I know you are desperate. Before Trent could respond, my father stepped forward to intervene. Pastor Silas cleared his throat, adjusting his gold cufflinks. He put on his best benevolent face, the one he used to charm thousands of parishioners every Sunday morning. Now see here, Dominique. There is absolutely no need for this kind of hostility. We are family. We bear each other's burdens in times of sorrow. Your sister and your brother-in-law are simply concerned for your well-being. The Lord teaches us to be prepared for the unexpected, and Julian's passing was a tragedy none of us foresaw. Do not dare quote scripture to me, to justify your greed, Dad, I snapped, cutting him off completely. I know exactly how this family operates, and I know exactly how this church operates. You have spent your entire career standing at a pulpit preaching about sacrifice, humility, and community, while secretly draining everyone around you to fund this fake First Family of Atlanta lifestyle. I gestured broadly around the opulent living room, pointing at the expensive art and the imported rugs. You built this perfect, flawless image of Black excellence for your congregation, but I know the books. I know you took the college fund you promised me when I was 18 and used it to quietly pay off a massive tax lien on this very estate. I had to take out crushing student loans and work 3 jobs to get my degree because you needed to buy my mother a new Mercedes to maintain appearances for the church board. I built my career from absolute scratch. And Julian knew it. He saw right through this pristine facade from the day he met you all. My mother Vivian stood up abruptly, her face flushed with righteous anger. How dare you speak to your father that way under his roof? We gave you everything. We gave you a respected name, a pedigree. We gave you a standard of living that most people only dream of. And you bring this disgusting disrespect into my house on the day we laid a family member to rest. Your house. I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that had no humor in it. I am standing in a house that is entirely mortgaged to its roof, Mother. Do not play the victim. I stood in that hallway for 10 minutes. I heard every single word you all said. I heard you talking about claiming the Aspen house for Chloe. I heard Trent bragging about an outdated will. You all think I am just some grieving, helpless widow who is too weak to fight back. You think because I do not wear my resume on my sleeve, because I do not boast about my salary, that I am stupid. Silence fell over the room again, heavy and suffocating. They realized I had caught them red-handed. The polite grieving daughter act was over. I was speaking to them not as family, but as an auditor, uncovering a massive corporate fraud. My father realized the guilt trip was no longer working. The gentle, benevolent patriarch routine immediately dropped away, replaced by the authoritative, commanding megachurch pastor who was used to absolute obedience from his flock. He straightened his posture, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence, and walked slowly toward me. He held out his large, heavy hand, palm up. He lowered his voice into that deep, booming baritone he used from the pulpit to force sinners into submission, aiming to intimidate me into compliance. "Listen to me very carefully," Dominique Silas said, his eyes turning hard, cold, and entirely unyielding. "You are clearly hysterical and completely not in your right mind right now. Your grief is clouding your judgment and making you paranoid." Julian had many complex business dealings. Real estate investments, corporate accounts, partnerships that are far too complicated for a woman in your deeply emotional state to handle. You are going to make a catastrophic mistake if you try to manage this alone. He took another step closer, looming over me, pointing a finger toward my leather handbag. You are going to open your purse right now. You are going to hand over Julian's bank cards, the keys to all of his properties, and his personal laptop. We are going to hold on to them and manage the estate for you. We will secure the assets until you are mentally stable enough to behave like a respectful daughter and a proper member of this family. Now hand them over to me. Now. I did not panic. I calmly moved my mouse away from the send button and locked my laptop screen, securing the encrypted FBI dossier behind a heavy biometric firewall. Let them pound. Let them act like the thugs they truly were. I walked out of the home office and down the long hallway toward the foyer. The heavy thudding against the steel door continued vibrating through the floorboards. I reached out and unlatched the deadbolt, pulling the heavy door open just as one of the men was rearing back to strike it again. Standing in my hallway were 2 massive men in cheap tactical gear, looking like rent-a-cops who took their jobs far too seriously. Behind them, looking incredibly smug, stood Trent and my sister Chloe. Trent pushed past the security guards and stepped over the threshold of my home without an invitation. He was holding a clipboard, attempting to look like a man of official business. Chloe followed close behind him, holding an empty designer tote bag and scanning the penthouse with the hungry eyes of a scavenger. "You did not answer your phone," Dominique Trent said, his tone dripping with condescension. "We told you we were not going to sit around and wait for you to hide the assets. The grace period is over." I crossed my arms, blocking his path to the living room. "You gave me a week to review the waiver, Trent, and you have no legal right to enter my home. A petition for probate does not grant you immediate physical access. This is trespassing." Trent laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "I am the interim asset manager. I signed the declaration this morning, remember? That gives me the right to secure Julian's property. Now step aside or my men will physically move you. We are here for the car keys, the corporate credit cards, and all the high-value jewelry Julian purchased with company funds." He was bluffing. He had absolutely no legal authority to seize anything without a judge's direct order, which he definitely did not have yet. What he was doing right now was not asset management. It was armed extortion, and it was beautiful. I did not argue. I did not scream for the police. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my slacks, pulled out my smartphone, and hit record. I held the camera up, making sure Trent's face and the two armed guards were clearly in the frame. "Are you refusing to leave my property?" I asked, keeping my voice level and clear for the audio recording. "Are you using these armed men to force me to hand over my personal belongings?" "Put that phone away!" Trent snapped, his face flushing red. "You think a video is going to save you? I am the executor. I am well within my rights to repossess estate property from a hostile occupant." He turned to his guards. "Go to the kitchen counter. Find the keys to the Porsche." As the two giant men stomped past me into my kitchen, Chloe pushed her way to the front. She glared at the phone in my hand, but she was too arrogant to care that she was being recorded. She wanted her moment of triumph. "You are so pathetic, Dominique," Chloe sneered, stepping right into the camera lens. "You always have to play the victim, do you not? You think you are so much better than us because you went to a fancy college and got some corporate job. You always looked down your nose at me just because I actually enjoyed the life our parents provided." She walked past me, heading straight down the hall toward the master bedroom. I followed her, keeping the camera perfectly steady. "You walked around this city acting like some high society queen," Chloe shouted over her shoulder, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "But you are nothing without Julian. You are just a freeloader who got lucky and married a rich man. You never belonged in this penthouse. And now you are going back to the bottom where you belong." Chloe stormed into the master bedroom. She ignored the walk-in closet filled with designer clothes. She walked straight over to the far wall above the fireplace. Hanging there was a breathtaking original oil painting Julian had commissioned for our first anniversary. It was a portrait of us walking through Piedmont Park, a piece of art that meant more to me than any diamond ring. Chloe reached up, grabbed the heavy gilded frame with both hands, and violently yanked it off the wall. The metal wire snapped with a sharp twang, and the bottom of the heavy frame slammed into the hardwood floor, scratching the pristine wood. "What are you doing?" I asked coldly, ensuring the camera captured her clutching the painting. "That was a personal gift from my husband. It is not a corporate asset." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Everything in this apartment belongs to the estate now. And since Trent is in charge, he promised I could have this for my new dining room. It is going to look so much better in a house where people actually appreciate expensive things." She dragged the heavy painting out of the bedroom, the wooden frame scraping loudly against the floorboards. I followed her back out to the foyer. Trent was standing by the front door, spinning the key fob to Julian's Porsche around his index finger. One of the security guards was holding my velvet jewelry box, which he had clearly just ripped out of my bedroom vanity. Trent looked at the camera in my hand and offered a sickeningly arrogant smile. "Record all you want, Dominique. Show it to your imaginary lawyer. No judge in Atlanta is going to side with a hysterical widow over the designated executor of a multi-million-dollar charity fund." He stepped out into the hallway, signaling for his guards and my sister to follow. Chloe dragged the painting out, bumping it carelessly against the doorframe. She shot me one last venomous glare before turning away. Trent paused right on the threshold. He looked at me, his eyes filled with absolute contempt. He gathered spit in his mouth and spat directly onto the marble floor of my entryway. "Pack your bags, Dominique," Trent said, his voice dripping with malice. "This weekend at the charity gala, I am officially taking the stage. I am going to announce my total takeover of Julian's empire in front of the entire city. When Monday morning comes, you will not even have a pot to piss in." He turned on his heel and walked away, the heavy footfalls of his guards echoing down the corridor. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the elevator doors slide shut behind them. The hallway fell dead silent. I looked down at the puddle of spit on my marble floor. I looked at the scratched wood where my sister had dragged my anniversary present. I looked at my phone hitting the stop button on the video recording. I had it all: the forced entry, the armed intimidation, the grand theft of personal property, the explicit confession from Trent that he was using his unverified status as an executor to strong-arm a widow. It was the absolute perfect cherry on top of a massive federal fraud sundae. I closed the heavy steel door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into Julian's home office, sat down at my desk, and woke up my laptop. The encrypted email to the FBI was still sitting on the screen exactly where I had left it. I attached the high-definition video file I had just recorded to the email thread. I typed a brief professional message to the senior agent. "Here is the final piece of evidence. The suspect has fully assumed fiduciary responsibility, confessed to misappropriating funds, and is now actively committing extortion across state lines using shell companies. He plans to make a public declaration of his financial control this Saturday at the Pastor Silas Charity Gala. Have your team ready." I took a deep breath, savoring the quiet hum of the computer. I clicked send. The email vanished from my outbox, rocketing through cyberspace straight to the federal authorities. The trap was officially set. My family wanted a public spectacle at the gala. They wanted to humiliate me in front of the entire elite class of Atlanta. I leaned back in Julian's leather chair and smiled in the dark. I was going to give them a show they would never ever forget. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, suffocating humidity that blanketed the city of Atlanta. I dressed in a simple, unbranded black dress, entirely different from the designer clothes my family loved to flaunt. I drove a rented sedan instead of the Porsche, pulling into the massive packed parking lot of the Pastor Silas Community Church. I did not walk through the VIP side entrance reserved for the pastor's family. I walked through the main double doors like a stranger and slipped quietly into the very last row of the sanctuary. The megachurch was a monument to my father's vanity. It seated 3,000 people, complete with high-definition broadcast screens, theatrical lighting, and a state-of-the-art sound system paid for by the working-class community of Atlanta. As the choir finished their opening hymn, the lights dimmed and Pastor Silas took the stage. He looked every bit the grieving patriarch, moving slowly, his head bowed, holding a leather-bound Bible against his chest. For the first 20 minutes, he preached about the fragility of life. He spoke beautifully about Julian, painting my husband as a generous benefactor and a beloved son. The congregation murmured in sympathetic agreement, but then my father shifted his tone. The sorrow in his voice morphed into a theatrical, righteous disappointment. He began to weave a narrative about the dangers of sudden wealth and the corruption of the human soul. He did not use my name. He did not have to. Sometimes my father bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "We see those we love turn their backs on their foundation. We see a young woman blessed with a good Christian upbringing become blinded by penthouses and luxury cars. We see a wife who cares more about the combination to the safe than the condition of her husband's soul. When tragedy strikes true, family draws closer to the Lord. But the wicked, the greedy, they only draw closer to the bank." A collective gasp swept through the congregation. Thousands of heads nodded. I could feel the eyes of the ushers and the regular members darting toward the back row, recognizing me. The whispers started immediately. My father was standing on his sacred stage, using the word of God to publicly brand his own daughter as a ruthless gold digger. He was laying the groundwork for the community to accept my upcoming eviction. He wanted them to believe I was a pariah who had been cast out of the family for my own materialistic sins. I sat perfectly still, my face entirely devoid of emotion. I let the humiliation wash over me, memorizing every word, every hypocritical tear my father wiped from his face. When the service finally ended, the congregation began to file out, giving my pew a wide berth as if my grief were contagious. I remained seated. I watched my mother Vivian walk down the center aisle. She was wearing a pristine white suit and an oversized church hat, looking like a queen inspecting her subjects. She stopped at the end of my row. She did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was sleeping. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and dropped it onto the wooden pew next to me. "Take this and buy yourself some decent food," Vivian said, her voice dripping with venomous pity. "And please do not come back here next Sunday. You are embarrassing this house. You made your choice when you decided to be difficult at the lawyer's office. Now you have to live with the consequences." I looked at the crumpled bill on the wood. I slowly reached out, picked it up, and slid it into my pocket. "Thank you, Mother," I said quietly. She offered a satisfied, haughty smirk, turned on her heel, and walked away. She thought she had broken me. She thought that $100 bill was a symbol of my absolute defeat. She had no idea it was the exact match I needed to burn her entire world to the ground. I drove straight back to the penthouse. I did not bother changing out of my church dress. I went directly into the home office, locked the door, and woke up my monitors. The public humiliation at the church had completely eradicated any lingering shred of familial guilt I might have had left. They wanted to play a public game of reputation destruction. It was time for me to find the final piece of the puzzle and end their game permanently. I pulled up the encrypted dossier I had compiled the night before. I had already proven that Trent embezzled $2 million from the church charity to cover his failed cryptocurrency exchange. But something in the ledger was still bothering me. As a forensic accountant, I know that failing at crypto is a quiet disaster. You lose your investors' money, you declare bankruptcy, and you hide. You do not panic and steal $2 million from a high-profile megachurch unless your life is actively in danger. I needed to know exactly who Trent was paying. I opened a secure network tunnel and bypassed the standard banking firewalls, diving straight into the raw blockchain data. I traced the specific hashes from Trent's offshore wallet in the Cayman Islands. He had tried to use a digital tumbler to mix the funds and hide the destination, a common tactic for amateur money launderers. But algorithms leave patterns, and I am an expert at finding them. It took me 3 grueling hours of writing custom decryption scripts. Finally, the tumbler broke and the true destination wallet appeared on my screen. I cross-referenced the wallet address with a restricted federal database I had access to from my previous corporate fraud cases. When the matching result flashed across my screen, my blood ran completely cold. The wallet did not belong to angry retail investors or a legitimate trading firm. It belonged to a shell company deeply tied to an Eastern European organized crime syndicate operating out of Miami. A syndicate notoriously known for predatory lending and violent debt collection. The massive, terrifying truth clicked into place. Trent had not just made bad trades. He had borrowed seed money from the mob, gambling on a risky crypto margin call, and he had lost everything. The syndicate came to collect. They probably threatened his life, or worse, threatened to bring the violence to my parents' doorstep. My father did not drain the church charity fund just to protect his family's image. He drained it to pay off a literal ransom. But there was a massive problem. The state of Georgia required all tax-exempt religious organizations of that size to undergo an independent financial audit every 3 years. I checked the state registry. My father's church was scheduled for a comprehensive audit at the end of the current fiscal quarter. That was less than 2 months away. If the state auditors looked at the books and saw $2 million missing, the investigation would immediately escalate to the federal level. My father would go to federal prison for embezzlement, and Trent would be exposed to both the FBI and the syndicate he had been trying to hide from. They were cornered. They were desperate. And then my wealthy husband tragically died. Julian's $5 million estate was the ultimate life raft. My family orchestrated the plot to use the outdated 2018 will to legally seize Julian's assets. Their plan was to quickly liquidate Julian's real estate, quietly dump $2 million back into the church charity fund before the state auditors arrived, and keep the remaining $3 million to themselves. Stealing from a grieving widow was not just an act of greed, it was a desperate act of survival. I leaned back in Julian's leather chair, staring at the glowing monitors. My family had dragged me into the middle of a federal racketeering conspiracy, and in their blind panic, Trent had officially signed a document legally declaring himself the sole financial manager of the charity, effectively shielding my father and taking the entire burden of the missing $2 million onto his own shoulders. This was no longer a civil dispute over a will. This was major federal crime. I picked up my cell phone. I bypassed my regular contacts and scrolled down to a secure encrypted number I had not dialed in over 2 years. It belonged to Special Agent Harrison, a senior investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation who specialized in organized crime and corporate money laundering. We had worked together on a massive corporate takedown, and he knew my forensic work was absolutely flawless. The line rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. Dominique Harrison said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I heard about your husband. I am so sorry for your loss. I did not expect to hear from you for a long time." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "But I am not calling for condolences. I am calling because I have a fully documented case of federal wire fraud, charity embezzlement, and money laundering tied directly to an organized crime syndicate." There was a brief pause on the line. The casual tone vanished from Harrison's voice, replaced immediately by sharp, professional focus. "Who is the target?" he asked. I looked at the framed photo of Julian sitting on my desk. I touched the glass, making a silent promise to the only man who had ever truly protected me. "The target is Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund," I said clearly. "And the primary suspect is my brother-in-law, Trent. He is planning to make a public declaration of his financial control this Saturday night at the church gala. I have all the ledgers, the IP traces, and a signed confession of fiduciary assumption. I am handing him to you on a silver platter, but we have to do it my way." I finalized the operational details with Special Agent Harrison, ensuring the FBI would be positioned exactly where I needed them on Saturday night. We agreed on the signal, the entry points, and the specific charges that would be filed the moment Trent made his public declaration. When I finally closed my laptop, the sun was already beginning to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my living room. I had not slept a single minute, but I had never felt more energized in my entire life. At exactly 9:15 on Monday morning, my cell phone vibrated violently against the marble kitchen counter. The caller ID flashed Trent's name. I let it ring 3 times. I pictured him standing in the lobby of some upscale downtown bank branch, sweating through his expensive suit, his fake confidence completely crumbling. Then I swiped to answer the call and placed the phone on the counter, switching on the speakerphone as I poured myself a fresh cup of black coffee. "What the hell did you do?" Trent screamed through the speaker. His voice was shrill, completely stripped of the smug, arrogant drawl he had used at the law firm just a few days ago. The sound of his sheer panic was absolute music to my ears. "Good morning to you too, Trent," I replied, my voice perfectly level and calm. "Do not play games with me, Dominique," he shouted, his breathing heavy and erratic. "I am sitting in the executive office at Chase Bank right now. I just presented the legally binding 2018 will, my identification, and the declaration of asset management that you signed. I instructed the branch manager to initiate a wire transfer of $2 million from Julian's primary investment account directly into the church charity fund. And the manager just told me the entire portfolio is locked. The accounts are completely frozen." I took a slow sip of my coffee, leaning against the marble counter. "I warned you that high-level finance was not child's play, Trent. You called the bank," he accused fiercely, his voice echoing slightly, as if he was pacing back and forth in a small enclosed office. "You called them and lied. You filed a fraudulent dispute to lock me out of the estate. I am calling my legal team right now. I am going to have you arrested for obstructing the execution of a legal will. You are going to federal prison for this, you spiteful witch. I set my coffee mug down. It was almost pathetic how little he understood about the financial systems he was trying to manipulate. I did not call anyone Trent, I said coldly. I did not need to. The banking system is designed to protect assets from amateur thieves like you. Did you honestly think you could walk into a major financial institution with an outdated piece of paper and simply demand $2 million in liquid cash? Shut up and unfreeze the accounts right now, he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. I cannot do that, I explained, enjoying every single second of his unraveling. When an unauthorized third party attempts to liquidate a massive portfolio belonging to a deceased individual, and then immediately tries to wire the exact amount of a massive ledger deficit to an unrelated charity account, the banking algorithms automatically flag it. You triggered a Level 4 security hold for suspected money laundering and wire fraud. The federal government froze those accounts, Trent, not me. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head as the sheer magnitude of his mistake finally caught up with him. He was trapped. The Russian syndicate was waiting for their money. My father was waiting for the charity books to be balanced before the state auditors arrived. And the only source of cash Trent had access to was now locked behind a wall of federal bureaucracy. You set me up, Trent whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. No, I corrected him sharply. I just let you operate under the illusion of your own intelligence. You signed the paperwork claiming full fiduciary responsibility. You demanded to be the interim asset manager. So step up and manage it. Go ahead and call the bank's compliance department. Explain to them why you desperately need $2 million in untraceable cash immediately. I'm sure they will be very understanding. The sound of my calm, mocking tone completely shattered whatever fragile grip Trent had left on his sanity. The cornered rat finally bared his teeth. You think you are so smart? Trent roared into the phone, his voice vibrating with pure, unadulterated hatred. You think you have won because you know a few banking rules. Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant bitch. The money does not matter. The will is still legal. The estate still belongs to us. And I am going to make you pay for every single second of this inconvenience. He was practically hyperventilating now, completely losing control of his carefully crafted corporate persona. This weekend at the charity gala, the entire elite circle of Atlanta will be there. Trent threatened, his words dripping with venom. The mayor, the city council, the biggest real estate investors in the state. And I am going to take the microphone and tell them exactly what you are. I will let this whole city know that you are nothing but a cheap whore who tried to rob her dead husband's family while his body was still warm. I will expose your greed. I will destroy your career, your name, and your entire miserable life. You will be blacklisted from every accounting firm in the country. By the time I am done with you on Saturday night, you will be begging to live in that garage storage room. He waited for a response. He wanted me to scream back. He wanted me to beg him not to ruin my reputation. He wanted the terrified widow to finally break down and surrender. Instead, I simply leaned closer to the phone. I will see you on Saturday, Trent. I pressed the red button, cutting the line dead. The sudden silence in my kitchen was peaceful, heavy, and absolute. He had just threatened to destroy me in front of the entire city. He was planning to turn the charity gala into my public execution. He had absolutely no idea that he had just built his own gallows. I walked out of the kitchen and headed straight into Julian's home office. I sat down at my workstation, opened the heavily encrypted folder I had sent to Special Agent Harrison the night before, and unsealed it for local access. The file contained the IP traces to the offshore crypto wallets. It contained the Delaware Shell Company registrations. It contained the forged consulting invoices my father had used to drain the charity. It contained Trent's signed declaration of fiduciary assumption. And it contained the high-definition video of Trent and my sister Chloe illegally entering my home and stealing Julian's property. I connected my laptop to the massive heavy-duty laser printer Julian kept in the corner of the office. I selected the entire dossier. 500 pages of undeniable, irrefutable, completely devastating financial evidence. I hit print. The large machine whirred to life with a deep mechanical hum. The paper tray began to feed. Page after page of crisp white paper shot out into the output tray. It was the sound of a closing trap. It was the sound of my family's pristine, untouchable empire being systematically dismantled, line by line, ledger by ledger. I stood in the center of the office watching the stack of printed evidence grow higher and higher. Trent wanted a public spectacle. My father wanted to preach about my sins to his wealthy congregation. My mother and sister wanted to parade around in my stolen jewelry while I was cast out onto the street. They wanted a show, and I was going to give them the greatest show this city had ever seen. Friday evening arrived, bringing a thick, oppressive heat that clung to the Atlanta pavement. I drove my rented sedan to a worn-down 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was the kind of place with flickering neon signs, cracked vinyl booths, and a smell of stale grease that permanently hung in the air. It was a place where nobody from my parents' wealthy image-obsessed congregation would ever be caught dead, which made it the perfect location to hand over the rope that would hang them. I walked inside carrying the heavy leather briefcase containing the 500 pages of printed evidence and a secure encrypted flash drive. The diner was mostly empty, save for a few exhausted truck drivers and a waitress wiping down the counter. I bypassed the main dining area and headed straight for the dimly lit corner booth in the back. Sitting there nursing a mug of black coffee was Special Agent Harrison. If you passed him on the street, you would never guess he was a senior federal investigator specializing in organized crime. He wore a slightly wrinkled gray suit and had a receding hairline that made him look like a tired mid-level accountant. That unassuming appearance was his greatest weapon. I slid into the booth opposite him and placed the heavy briefcase squarely on the table. "You look good," Dominique Harrison said, offering a small, tight nod. "Considering everything you have been through this week, I am not here for small talk, Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice low so it would not carry over the hum of the diner refrigerators. "I told you I had a complete case. It is all in there." I unlatched the briefcase and turned it around, pushing it across the table. Harrison opened the lid. His eyes immediately fell on the thick stack of meticulously organized documents, categorized with color-coded tabs referencing transaction dates, IP addresses, and bank routing numbers. He pulled out the executive summary I had drafted and began to read. For 5 straight minutes, the only sound in our booth was the rustling of paper. I watched his expression carefully. Harrison was a seasoned veteran who had seen every type of corporate corruption imaginable, but as he reached the page detailing the blockchain transfers and the Eastern European syndicate, his jaw visibly tightened. "You traced the crypto tumbler?" Harrison murmured, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "We have an entire cyber division at the Bureau that has been trying to crack this specific syndicate's money laundering pipeline for 8 months, and you just unraveled it from a home office." "I know how to follow the money," I said simply. "My brother-in-law Trent is a fool. He panicked when his margins collapsed and he borrowed from the wrong people. When the syndicate came to collect, my father authorized the embezzlement of $2 million from his church charity fund to bail Trent out. They are currently trying to hijack my late husband's estate using an outdated will to replace the stolen charity funds before the state tax board audits the church next month." Harrison closed the folder and rested his hands flat on top of the briefcase. "This is incredible work, Dominique. You have handed us the shell companies, the forged invoices, and the illicit ledgers. The paper trail is flawless. But we have a legal hurdle to consider before I can send a tactical team to make arrests." I leaned forward, crossing my arms over the table. "Explain the hurdle. Your brother-in-law signed that declaration of fiduciary assumption, which is fantastic." Harrison began, his tone shifting into pure legal strategy. "It binds him to the financial state of the charity. However, a high-priced defense attorney will argue that Trent was manipulated. They will claim he signed a piece of paper he did not understand and that he had not actually exercised any real control over the funds yet. Because the bank froze the accounts before he could execute the wire transfer, his defense team will argue that no actual theft from the estate occurred under his command. They will try to throw the entire blame onto your father and paint Trent as an unwitting victim. I shook my head. Trent is not a victim. He orchestrated the forced entry into my home. He tried to extort me for the physical assets. I know that, and you know that, Harrison said gently. But federal court requires absolute, undeniable proof of intent. To nail Trent for federal wire fraud and to legally tie him to the syndicate's money laundering operation, we need an overt act. We need him to explicitly, voluntarily, and publicly claim absolute dominion and control over the charity fund and your husband's estate. We need him to brag about it. We need him to tell the world that he is the one pulling the strings after the fraud has already taken place. If we get that, the trap snaps shut and no lawyer in the country can save him. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked out the diner window at the dark street. Trent's massive, fragile ego was his greatest weakness, and he had already given me the exact blueprint for his destruction. He threatened me a few days ago, I told Harrison, turning my attention back to the federal agent. When he found out the bank accounts were frozen, he called me in a complete panic. He promised that he was going to expose me and humiliate me in front of the entire city. Harrison raised an eyebrow. How exactly does he plan to do that? Tomorrow night, my father is hosting the annual Pastor Silas Community Charity Gala at the downtown convention center. I explained, my voice perfectly steady. The guest list includes the mayor, the city council, and hundreds of the wealthiest investors in Atlanta. It is the biggest social event of the year for their inner circle. Trent told me that he is going to take the stage tomorrow night. He is going to use a microphone to formally announce his total takeover of my husband's empire and his absolute control over the charity fund. He wants the prestige. He wants the applause. Harrison's eyes widened slightly as the perfection of the setup dawned on him. He is going to publicly claim control of an embezzled fund in front of the city's elite. Exactly. I nodded. He is going to stand under the spotlight and verbally confess to having fiduciary authority over the exact accounts the syndicate is using. He wants to use that stage to destroy my reputation and declare himself the new king of the family. Harrison let out a low whistle, tapping his fingers against the leather briefcase. That is not just a confession, Dominique. That is a theatrical suicide. If he makes that statement, the burden of proof is instantly met. We can arrest him the second he steps off that stage. I need your team ready, Harrison. I want plainclothes agents inside the ballroom. I want marked units waiting at the service exits. I do not want them to have a single inch of breathing room when the illusion drops. My family loves to put on a show for the public. I want to make sure the finale is unforgettable. Consider it done, Harrison said, his voice hardening with absolute professional authority. We will have the perimeter secured by 6 o'clock tomorrow evening. We will record every word he says on that stage. But Dominique, you have to be absolutely sure you can handle this. It is going to be incredibly ugly. When the handcuffs come out, your family is going to turn on you like wolves. I looked at the federal agent, feeling the cool, analytical calm wash over me. For years, I had let my family belittle me, manipulate me, and drain me, all in the name of keeping the peace. But the woman who used to shrink under their disapproval had died the moment they tried to steal Julian's legacy. Let them turn, I said softly. I am an auditor, Harrison. I only care about balancing the books. And my family is carrying a massive debt. I stood up from the cracked vinyl booth, adjusting my coat. I looked down at the briefcase containing the ruin of the Silas family empire. Get your agents in position, Harrison. Tomorrow night at the gala, I will personally hand you his confession. Saturday evening descended on Atlanta, bringing with it a thick, humid dusk that seemed to coat the city in gold. The penthouse was completely quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the hollow, suffocating silence of grief that had plagued every waking moment since I buried Julian. This was the heavy, pressurized calm that settles over the ocean just before a massive hurricane makes landfall. I stood in the center of my expansive walk-in closet, surrounded by the beautiful remnants of the life my husband and I had built together. Tonight was the night. Right now, across the city at the luxurious downtown convention center, the annual Pastor Silas Community Charity Gala was kicking off. I could perfectly picture the scene. Caterers in crisp white uniforms were likely arranging crystal champagne flutes and carrying trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The massive ballroom would be decorated with elaborate floral centerpieces, all paid for by the hard-earned donations of the working-class members of my father's congregation. My mother Vivian was undoubtedly holding court in the VIP lounge, sipping top-shelf liquor and showing off the jewelry Chloe had stolen from my bedroom. My father was probably shaking hands with the mayor, projecting the image of a humble, grieving patriarch. And Trent, the delusional architect of his own demise, was likely pacing in front of a mirror somewhere practicing the grand authoritative speech he planned to deliver to the city's elite. They were celebrating my destruction. They genuinely believed they had successfully discarded me. They thought I was sitting alone in this dark penthouse, crying into a suitcase, preparing to quietly move into the dusty, uninsulated storage room above their garage. They thought the game was over. They had absolutely no idea that I had just finished dealing the cards. I reached out and ran my fingers along a heavy canvas garment bag hanging at the very end of the clothing rack. I unzipped it in one long, smooth motion, revealing the dress I had purchased months ago for a corporate awards banquet Julian and I were supposed to attend together. It was a masterpiece by Tom Ford, a floor-length midnight black silk gown that draped like liquid armor. It had a high-structured neckline, sharp, assertive shoulders that projected absolute uncompromising authority and a daring, sweeping open back. It was certainly not a dress meant for a grieving broken widow begging for scraps from her family table. It was the uniform of a woman who was about to systematically dismantle an empire. I slipped the heavy silk over my body, feeling the cool, expensive fabric mold perfectly to my frame. I walked over to my vanity and sat down staring at my bare face in the brightly illuminated mirror. For the past week, I had intentionally worn absolutely no makeup around my family. I had let my hair sit in a messy, careless bun. I had purposefully given them the exact visual aesthetic of a defeated, exhausted victim. I let them see the weakness they desperately wanted to see. But that performance was officially over. I applied my makeup with the cold, calculated precision of a surgeon. I drew sharp, dark winged eyeliner that made my eyes look like pieces of obsidian glass. I applied a deep, matte crimson lipstick that looked like dried blood against my skin. I pulled my thick hair back into a sleek, impossibly tight chignon, locking it in place with heavy pins, leaving not a single strand out of place to soften my face. When I finished, there was zero vulnerability left in my features. I looked cold, untouchable, and lethal. I looked exactly like the senior forensic accountant who tore apart fraudulent corporations for a living. I opened the hidden reinforced compartment of my vanity desk, bypassing the empty velvet jewelry slots where Chloe and Trent had scavenged my everyday pieces. I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a heavy, polished mahogany box, secured with a biometric lock. I pressed my thumb firmly against the glowing green sensor. The machine beeped softly and the lid sprang open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, lay the absolute crown jewels of Julian's immense generosity. A breathtaking custom-designed collar necklace made of flawless Colombian emeralds and brilliant cut diamonds, accompanied by a pair of heavy matching drop earrings. Julian had bought this magnificent set for me during an anniversary trip to Paris 2 years ago. The insurance valuation of this single box was worth more than the entire equity of my parents' fake, heavily mortgaged mansion. I fastened the heavy diamond clasp around my neck, feeling the cold, substantial weight of the stones resting against my collarbone. It was a heavy burden of wealth, and I wore it as a shield. I put the earrings in the diamonds, catching the vanity lights and throwing sharp reflections across the room. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror, positioned near the massive bedroom windows. The glittering skyline of Atlanta stretched out behind me through the glass, a sea of lights in the warm southern night. But my focus was entirely on the woman standing in the reflection. I honestly hardly recognized her. The timid, anxious girl who used to desperately seek her mother's conditional approval was completely gone. The obedient daughter who used to swallow her father's hypocritical gaslighting sermons just to keep the fragile peace was dead. In her place stood a financial apex predator. I looked deeply into my own reflection, and suddenly the memory of Julian washed over me. It was so intense, so incredibly vivid. It felt as though he was standing right behind me in the room, resting his hands on my shoulders. I remembered a specific night 3 years ago. I had been sitting at my desk quietly crying over a cruel voicemail my mother had left me. She had called to criticize my career choice, mocking my accounting degree as a glorified bookkeeping certificate, telling me I was embarrassing the family by not pursuing law or medicine. Julian had walked into the home office, gently closed my laptop screen, and pulled me up into his arms. He had tilted my chin up, forcing me to look him directly in the eye. "You listen to me very carefully, Dominique," he had said, his voice a low, steady anchor in my emotional storm. "Your family trades in lies. They build their entire existence on illusions, manipulation, and fake smiles. They survive by making everyone around them feel small. But you do not live in their world. You live in the world of absolute truth. You are the keeper of the numbers, and the numbers never lie. They can preach from a pulpit all they want. They can pretend to be holy, but at the end of the day, the ledger always balances. You have the power to expose exactly who people really are. Never let them make you feel small for wielding the truth. The numbers never lie." Julian's words echoed loudly in my mind, hardening the last remaining fragments of my broken, grieving heart into solid, unbreakable steel. My family had tried to steal his legacy. They had tried to use his tragic, sudden death to fund a criminal enterprise and line their own greedy pockets. They had brought armed thugs into his home, dragged his artwork across the floor, and spat on his marble entryway. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They forgot who held the ledger. I picked up a small, sleek black clutch purse from the bed. Inside, I placed my cell phone, a touch-up tube of the crimson lipstick, and the single crisp $100 bill my mother had so graciously thrown at me in the church pew last Sunday. I wanted to have it handy when they inevitably asked how I was going to pay for my cab ride back to the slums. I walked out of the master bedroom, my heels clicking sharply and rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The sound was purposeful and entirely unafraid. I bypassed the main entrance doors of the penthouse and headed straight down the hall for the private secured elevator that led directly into Julian's subterranean garage. As the heavy metal doors slid open at the bottom, the motion sensor lights flickered on in sequence, illuminating the pristine concrete bay. And there, sitting alone in the center of the private garage, gleaming flawlessly under the bright fluorescent lights, was Julian's black Porsche. The very same car Trent had desperately tried to steal from me. The car he arrogantly assumed I would never have the keys to drive again. I walked up to the driver's side door and pressed the button on the key fob. The sharp chirp of the alarm echoed loudly against the concrete walls, unlocking the vehicle. I slid down into the low, premium leather driver's seat, wrapping my hands tightly around the steering wheel. The scent of Julian cedar and black pepper cologne still faintly lingered in the expensive upholstery, wrapping around me like a final protective blessing. I pushed the heavy silver ignition button. The massive twin-turbo engine roared to life with a violent, thunderous growl that violently shook the floorboards and instantly tore through the silent Atlanta night. I shifted the sleek car into drive, slammed my stiletto-covered foot hard onto the gas pedal, and drove straight out of the darkness, heading directly toward the spotlight. I pulled the roaring black Porsche into the brightly lit circular driveway of the downtown convention center. The valet line was already packed with luxury sedans and imported sports cars, but the sheer guttural sound of Julian's twin-turbo engine immediately commanded the attention of everyone standing near the entrance. Flashbulbs from local society photographers went off as I brought the heavy vehicle to a smooth, perfect stop right in front of the red carpet. A young valet in a crisp uniform rushed forward to open my door. I stepped out into the humid night air, the heavy silk of my Tom Ford gown cascading perfectly around my legs. I handed the valet the keys and walked up the steps, completely ignoring the curious whispers of the paparazzi. Inside the convention center was a sickening, overwhelming display of stolen opulence. The grand ballroom was entirely transformed. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of round tables draped in heavy white linen. Towering floral centerpieces of imported white orchids sat in the center of every table. A string quartet played softly in the corner, entirely drowned out by the loud, arrogant chatter of Atlanta's elite. Mayor, city council members, real estate moguls, and wealthy socialites filled the room holding crystal champagne flutes and laughing. Through the massive glass partitions of the foyer, I could see my family holding court in the center of the room. They were absolutely thriving in the spotlight. My father, Pastor Silas, stood near the main stage wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, shaking hands with wealthy investors and offering them his best, most pious smile. He looked exactly like a grieving but resilient patriarch, expertly milking the room for sympathy and future donations. A few feet away from him, my mother Vivian was surrounded by a circle of wealthy wives. She was laughing politely, holding a glass of sparkling wine. I narrowed my eyes. Resting perfectly against her collarbone was the diamond tennis necklace Chloe had stolen from my bedroom just a few days ago. They were not even trying to hide their theft. They were parading my stolen property in front of the entire city, entirely confident that I was sitting at home completely broken and powerless. And then there was Trent. My utterly useless, fraudulent brother-in-law was standing near the front row of VIP tables, practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. He was speaking to a group of Julian's former business partners, gesturing wildly, with his hands acting as if he had built the Washington real estate empire from the ground up. Chloe stood right beside him wearing a bright red designer dress that screamed for attention, clinging to his arm like she was the First Lady of Atlanta. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cold, heavy weight of the Colombian emeralds around my neck ground me. I nodded to the two event staff members standing by the massive double doors of the ballroom. They pulled the heavy brass handles, opening the doors wide. I stepped over the threshold and walked straight into the light. I did not sneak in. I did not walk around the edges of the room. I walked directly down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. For the first few seconds, no one noticed. But as I moved deeper into the ballroom, the conversations closest to me began to stop. Heads turned, glasses were lowered. The wealthy elite of Atlanta, who had spent the last week hearing whispers about the disgraced, greedy widow who had been cast out of the Silas family, stared at me in absolute shock. I did not look like a disgraced widow. I looked like a queen stepping onto a battlefield to reclaim her throne. The midnight black silk of my gown moved like liquid armor. The millions of dollars worth of flawless emeralds and diamonds resting against my skin caught the light of the chandeliers, throwing blinding flashes across the room. I kept my chin high, my posture perfectly straight, and my eyes locked dead ahead. The silence spread rapidly across the massive room like a physical wave. The string quartet suddenly sounded very loud as the chatter of hundreds of people died down to a stunned, echoing murmur. My mother was the first one of the family to see me. She was in the middle of a polite laugh when her eyes locked onto my face. The laugh died instantly in her throat. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and terrified under her expensive makeup. Her hand flew up to her chest, her fingers reflexively clutching the diamond necklace she had stolen from me, as if she realized she was wearing a dead woman's jewelry and the ghost had just walked into the room. Chloe saw me next. Her jaw literally dropped open. She let go of Trent's arm and took a step back, her eyes wide with a mixture of sheer panic and furious disbelief. She looked at my dress, she looked at my emeralds, and I could see the absolute rage boiling in her eyes. She had expected me to show up in rags begging for mercy. Instead, I had effortlessly eclipsed every single person in the room. Trent turned around, noticing the sudden silence. When he saw me walking down the center aisle, his smug, arrogant smile vanished. His face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He quickly whispered something to Chloe, abandoning his conversation with the real estate moguls, and began marching directly toward me, waving his hand to signal the event security. Vivian and Chloe completely abandoned their high society composure. They practically shoved past the wealthy wives they had been entertaining and rushed down the aisle to intercept me before I could reach the VIP seating area in the front. "What are you doing here?" Vivian hissed venomously, stepping directly into my path to block me. She kept her voice low, desperately trying to maintain appearances in front of the staring crowd. "You have no right to show your face in this room. You are embarrassing your father. Turn around and walk out the back door right now, Dominique, before I have you physically thrown onto the street." I stopped walking, looking down at my mother with absolute freezing contempt. "I am perfectly fine right where I am." "Mother," I replied, my voice steady and carrying just enough volume for the closest tables to hear. "And I suggest you take off my diamond necklace before it starts to chafe your skin." Chloe stepped up beside her mother, her face red with anger. "You are insane," she whispered furiously. "You think you can just crash our event dressed like some ridiculous movie star? Trent told the bank to freeze your accounts. We know you are completely broke. You probably rented that dress. Get out of here before you make an absolute fool of yourself." Before I could respond to my sister's pathetic insults, Trent arrived. He was trailed by two massive convention center security guards in dark suits. Trent looked incredibly smug again, clearly believing that having physical muscle behind him gave him the ultimate authority in the room. "Officers," Trent said loudly, deliberately, raising his voice so the surrounding guests could hear him. "This woman is a hostile, uninvited guest. She has been harassing my family all week following the death of her husband. She is emotionally unstable and she is trespassing at a private charity event. Please escort her out of the building immediately. If she resists, call the police." The two large security guards stepped forward, looking entirely uncomfortable, but preparing to do their jobs. "Ma'am," one of them said, reaching a hand out toward my arm, "I am going to have to ask you to come with us quietly." I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I simply raised my hand, stopping the guard in his tracks with a single authoritative look. I reached into my sleek black clutch purse and slowly pulled out a heavy gold-embossed lanyard. I held it up so the guards, my family, and everyone watching could clearly see it. Printed in bold black letters across the gold pass were the words, "Platinum Benefactor. All Access." Julian had secured a lifetime platinum sponsorship for the Pastor Silas charity 5 years ago, making a massive foundational donation that effectively bankrolled this entire event. Because all of his assets were held in the Irrevocable Living Trust, and I was the sole trustee, that lifetime platinum status belonged entirely to me, too. "I believe there is a misunderstanding, gentlemen," I said, looking directly at the head security guard. "I am not an uninvited guest. I am the primary financial sponsor of this entire gala. As a platinum benefactor, I have legal access to every single room in this building. If you attempt to lay a hand on me, or if you attempt to remove me from the premises, I will not just sue this convention center into total bankruptcy. I will personally ensure that your security firm loses its licensing by Monday morning." The guards froze. They looked at the heavy gold pass, recognized the authentic event credentials, and immediately took two large steps back. They were not paid enough to physically assault a platinum donor, especially one threatening them with a high-powered corporate lawsuit. "She is lying." Trent shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "That pass belongs to my brother-in-law. He is dead. The estate is under my control. I am the interim asset manager. I want her out." The security guard shook his head, looking apologetically at Trent. "I am sorry, sir. That pass scans as active under the Washington Trust. We cannot legally eject a platinum benefactor from the ballroom without a direct order from the police. You will have to handle this yourselves." The guards turned and quickly walked away, completely abandoning Trent in the middle of the aisle. The look of absolute soul-crushing defeat on Trent's face was a masterpiece. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, completely powerless. Chloe looked like she was going to burst into tears of pure frustration. My mother slowly backed away, realizing that they had just lost the physical confrontation in front of half the city. "Enjoy your evening, family," I said quietly, offering them a chilling, predatory smile. I stepped around them, the silk of my dress brushing lightly against Trent's leg. I walked straight to the absolute front row of the ballroom and took a seat at the center table right in front of the main stage. The lights in the massive room suddenly began to dim. The string quartet stopped playing. A heavy, dramatic silence fell over the crowd as a single bright spotlight illuminated the podium. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said enthusiastically, "thank you for joining us for this incredible evening of giving. To begin our program, we have a very special announcement regarding the future of our community and the legacy of a great man. Please welcome to the stage the new managing director of the Julian Washington Enterprise and the director of the Pastor Silas Charity Fund, Mr. Trent Evans." Trent stood frozen in the aisle for a brief moment. He looked at me sitting in the front row, looking like an apex predator waiting for its prey. He swallowed hard, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with trembling hands. His massive ego simply could not let him back down now. He had the crowd. He had the spotlight. He wanted the absolute power he had been craving his entire life. Trent turned his back to me and began walking up the steps to the stage, preparing to claim an empire that did not belong to him, completely unaware that the FBI was waiting in the shadows to take it all away. Trent stepped up to the acrylic podium, basking in the warm glow of the spotlight. The polite applause from the hundreds of wealthy guests washed over him, feeding his massive, fragile ego. He gripped the edges of the podium, puffing out his chest as he looked out over the sea of faces. From my seat in the front row, I could see the slight tremor in his hands, but his face was set in a mask of practiced, solemn authority. He leaned into the microphone, letting a heavy, dramatic silence fall over the grand ballroom before he spoke. "Thank you, ladies and gentlemen," Trent began, his voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the spirit of giving, but we also carry a heavy heart. As many of you know, our family recently suffered a devastating loss. Julian Washington was not just a titan of the real estate industry. He was a visionary. He was a brother to me." I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully in my lap, my expression completely unreadable. Hearing Julian's name in his mouth was like swallowing broken glass, but I did not flinch. I let him spin his web. Julian was a man who planned for the future. Trent continued, his voice taking on a rehearsed, mournful cadence. He cared deeply about this community, and he cared deeply about the mission of the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund. That is why before his tragic and untimely passing, Julian made his final wishes legally binding and abundantly clear. He did not want his massive estate tied up in frivolous personal matters. He wanted his empire to serve a higher purpose. Trent paused, allowing the crowd to absorb the manufactured nobility of his words. He looked toward the VIP tables where my father and mother were sitting. Pastor Silas nodded gravely, playing the part of the humble servant of God. "It is with a profound sense of duty that I stand before you tonight," Trent declared, raising his chin. "I am officially announcing that I have legally assumed full, unrestricted fiduciary responsibility for the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund. Furthermore, As the designated executor of Julian's estate, I have taken absolute operational control of all his commercial properties, liquid assets, and corporate holdings. There it was. The overt act, the explicit public and entirely voluntary confession of financial control. Somewhere in the shadows of this massive convention center, Special Agent Harrison and his team were recording every single syllable. Trent had just permanently locked his own prison cell. The crowd erupted into polite, approving applause. Real estate developers and city officials nodded in respect, completely unaware that they were clapping for a man who had just stolen millions of dollars to pay off an Eastern European crime syndicate. Trent soaked in the admiration, his chest swelling with unadulterated triumph. But he could not stop there. His arrogance demanded a total, flawless victory. He needed to crush me publicly to ensure no one in this room would ever take my side. Trent raised his hand to quiet the applause. He lowered his voice, adopting a sickeningly sweet tone of manufactured compassion. He turned his head and looked directly down at me, sitting in the front row. The spotlight shifted slightly, catching the brilliant fire of the Colombian emeralds resting against my collarbone. Before we move forward, we must acknowledge the immense pain of Julian's widow, Dominique Trent said smoothly, directing the attention of the entire ballroom right at me. Grief is a terrible, blinding force. It can overwhelm the mind and fracture the spirit. We as a family have had to step in because the crushing weight of this tragedy has left her completely unable to handle the complex, demanding realities of high-level finance and estate management. He offered me a look of pure, concentrated pity, mixed with a venomous warning. He wanted the city to see me as a fragile, broken woman who had to be relieved of her duties for her own good. "We ask for your prayers for Dominique during this dark time," Trent concluded softly. "We hope that with time, and with the family taking this heavy financial burden off her shoulders, she can find some peace in a quieter, simpler life." A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the wealthy crowd. Several women sitting at the tables near me offered me sad, patronizing smiles. They bought the performance entirely. They saw a benevolent brother-in-law protecting a hysterical widow from ruining her own life. Trent smiled down at me, his eyes gleaming with absolute victory. He had delivered his lines perfectly. He thought he had successfully rewritten history in front of the entire elite class of Atlanta. He thought I was going to lower my head in shame. Instead, I slowly pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was deliberate and completely devoid of hesitation. The midnight black silk of my Tom Ford gown fell flawlessly around me. The heavy diamonds around my neck caught the intense glare of the stage lights. I did not look broken. I did not look hysterical. I looked like a woman who owned every single inch of the ground I walked on. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died away. The ballroom plunged into a breathless, terrifying silence. Everyone watched as I stepped out from behind the table and walked toward the stage stairs. I heard my mother gasp sharply from the VIP section. I heard my father urgently whisper my name, trying to stop me without causing a scene. I ignored them completely. I kept my eyes locked onto Trent's face. As I placed my stiletto on the first wooden step, the smug satisfaction on Trent's face began to crack. He gripped the edges of the podium tighter. His eyes darted nervously toward the security guards standing at the perimeter, but the guards did not move. They remembered the gold platinum benefactor pass in my purse, and they were not going to risk their careers to save him. I walked up the steps, the rhythmic clicking of my heels echoing loudly through the silent room. I reached the stage level and walked directly toward the podium. Dominique Trent hissed under his breath, leaning away from the microphone so the crowd could not hear his panic. "What are you doing? Sit down before I have you arrested. You are making a fool of yourself." I did not answer him. I did not stop walking. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to instinctively take a step back from the podium. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of my presence completely eclipsed him. He was a coward playing dress-up in a tailored suit, and he shrank the moment a real predator stepped onto his stage. Without breaking eye contact with him, I reached out and firmly snatched the microphone right out of his trembling hand. He let it go without a fight, completely paralyzed by the cold, lethal certainty in my eyes. I turned my back on him, dismissing him entirely. and faced the hundreds of powerful guests sitting in the grand ballroom. I stood at the absolute center of the stage. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces, taking a moment to let the intense silence stretch. I saw my sister Chloe practically vibrating with rage in her seat. I saw my father looking around the room, desperately trying to figure out how to salvage his pristine reputation. I raised the microphone. My voice was perfectly calm, incredibly clear, and absolutely unshakable. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the convention center. "I appreciate the outpouring of sympathy, but I assure you, my mind is exceptionally clear, and I am far from overwhelmed." I turned my head slightly, looking past the bright stage lights toward the AV control booth situated at the very back of the massive ballroom. I offered a single sharp nod. The AV technician, a man I had very generously tipped earlier this evening, while showing my platinum benefactor credentials, hit the switch on his console exactly as I had instructed. The massive high-definition LED screen covering the entire wall behind the podium suddenly flashed to life. The bright white glare washed over Trent, illuminating his pale, terrified face. I turned back to the crowd, my voice dropping into a register of absolute unforgiving authority. "Everyone just heard a touching story," I announced, the sound ringing out like a final judgment over the silent room. "Now let us hear the story of the numbers." The massive high-definition screen behind me flashed with a brilliant white light, casting stark shadows across the silent ballroom. A collective intake of breath echoed from the hundreds of wealthy guests as a crisp, perfectly scanned legal document appeared on the display, magnified to a towering 30 feet tall. I pointed to the bold black lettering at the very top of the page. "The document you are looking at is the Julian Washington Irrevocable Living Trust," I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute clarity. "It was fully executed and notarized exactly 2 years ago." I slowly paced across the center of the stage, my eyes sweeping over the crowd before locking onto my family sitting in the front row. Trent had claimed to be a master of high-level finance. He stood on this very stage and confidently told all of you that he was taking control of Julian's estate based on a piece of paper from 2018. But Trent forgot the most fundamental rule of asset protection in the United States legal system. A properly funded living trust completely bypasses probate court, and it absolutely supersedes any outdated will. I signaled the audiovisual technician in the back of the room. The screen transitioned, displaying a long, detailed ledger of assets. Over the last 2 years, Julian legally transferred every single thing he owned into this trust, I explained, articulating every word so there could be no misunderstanding. The $5 million in liquid capital, the deeds to the 3 commercial real estate properties, the penthouse I currently live in, even the black Porsche sitting in the valet line right outside those doors. It was all placed under the protective umbrella of this trust. And as you can see by the signatures at the bottom of the document, Julian named only one beneficiary and only one sole trustee with the power to manage it: me. I looked directly down at Trent, who was still standing paralyzed near the edge of the stage. He was staring up at the massive screen, his face draining of all color until he looked physically ill. "When Julian passed away, he did not own a single personal asset," I said, delivering the crushing blow with a perfectly steady voice. "There is no estate for probate court to freeze. There is no multi-million-dollar portfolio for you to manage. That 2018 will you are so desperately clutching is nothing but a worthless piece of paper. Julian left you absolutely nothing." The silence in the ballroom was deafening. The wealthy investors, city council members, and real estate moguls stared at the screen, processing the sheer magnitude of the legal checkmate I had just executed. Down in the VIP section, my mother Vivian collapsed back into her chair, her hand flying to her mouth in sheer horror. The realization that they were not getting a single penny of Julian's wealth hit her like a physical blow. Chloe sat completely frozen, her eyes wide with shock, looking back and forth between the screen and her husband. But Trent's massive ego refused to let him surrender. The public humiliation was too much for his fragile pride to process. He snapped out of his stunned silence, his face flushing with a violent, desperate red. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are lying!" Trent screamed, his voice raw and frantic, completely abandoning his polished corporate persona. "This is a trick. It does not matter what that screen says. I have the legal paperwork. I have the Declaration of Interim Asset Management. And you signed it. You signed the acknowledgement right in front of the lawyer. I am the legal manager of the church charity fund and all integrated assets." A cold, ringing laugh escaped my lips. The sound echoed through the microphone, slicing through his panic. I signaled the technician again. The screen behind me shifted instantly. The massive display now showed the exact document Trent had forced me to sign in the law office just a few days ago. The camera zoomed in on the fine print in the middle of the page, highlighting paragraph 4, subsection B in bright yellow. "You are absolutely right, Trent," I said, a dangerous smile spreading across my face. "I did sign that paper. And I want to personally thank you for forcing me to do it, because you were so blinded by your own greed, so desperate to sit on a throne that did not belong to you, that you completely failed to understand the legal definition of fiduciary assumption." Trent stared at the highlighted text on the screen, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid as he read his own bloated legal jargon. "By signing that declaration and legally integrating your authority over the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund, you did not gain access to my husband's wealth," I explained, making sure every single donor in the room heard me perfectly. "My husband's wealth was completely shielded by the trust. What you actually did, Trent, was legally absorb every single historical debt liability and financial encumbrance attached to my father's church. You officially told the federal government that you and you alone are personally responsible for the financial integrity of this charity." I did not give him a chance to respond. I did not give him a second to breathe. I signaled the technician for the final devastating blow. The screen flashed red. A massive, incredibly detailed forensic audit report filled the 30-foot display. It was a terrifying maze of red ink banking routing numbers, offshore IP addresses, and heavily redacted shell company registrations. It was the exact dossier I had handed to the FBI. I turned my attention away from Trent and faced the hundreds of wealthy donors sitting at the tables. The people who had written massive checks to my father, believing they were funding community outreach and youth scholarships. "As a forensic accountant, it is my job to find missing money," I announced, my voice carrying the lethal weight of absolute truth. "And 8 months ago, exactly $2 million mysteriously vanished from the primary operating account of the Pastor Silas Community Charity Fund." A loud collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as several prominent donors abruptly stood up, their faces contorted with confusion and growing anger. I pointed to the massive flowchart glowing on the screen. The money did not go to the community. It was secretly wired through 3 Delaware shell companies, tumbled through an unregulated cryptocurrency exchange, and deposited directly into offshore wallets belonging to an Eastern European organized crime syndicate. The murmurs in the crowd instantly escalated into a chaotic uproar. People were shouting, demanding to know what was going on. Trent Evans lost his investors' money in a disastrous margin call. I shouted over the rising noise of the crowd, pointing directly at my brother-in-law. He was drowning in debt to dangerous people, and instead of facing the consequences, he went to my father. "Pastor Silas authorized the embezzlement of $2 million of your donation money to pay off a mob debt just to keep his golden family from facing a public scandal." Total chaos erupted. The polite high society gala instantly transformed into a scene of absolute outrage. The donors realized they had been conned. They realized their generous contributions had been used to fund a criminal enterprise. Angry shouts echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Several men began moving aggressively toward the front of the room, yelling at my father to explain himself. Down in the VIP section, the facade of the perfect Silas family completely shattered. My father jumped up from his table, his face twisted in absolute panic. "Shut it down!" Silas roared, his booming pastor voice cracking with desperation. "Turn off that screen! Cut her microphone! She is lying! She is insane!" He lunged toward the stage stairs, desperately trying to physically stop me. Vivian was right behind him, shrieking in pure hysteria, her manicured hands clawing at the air. But they never made it to the stage. The two massive convention center security guards, the exact same guards Trent had tried to use to throw me out just 10 minutes earlier, stepped directly into my parents' path. They crossed their arms, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between the furious crowd and the stage. They looked at the forensic evidence displayed on the massive screen. They looked at the angry mob of wealthy donors, and they made the absolute correct decision to protect the platinum benefactor over the exposed embezzlers. "Let me through!" my father screamed, shoving uselessly against the chest of the massive security guard. "I am the pastor of this church. This is my event." "You are a thief," a prominent real estate developer yelled from the second row, throwing his linen napkin onto the floor in disgust. "I wrote you a check for $50,000 last month. Where is my money, Silas?" Trent was completely cornered. He backed away from the stage, his eyes darting frantically around the room looking for an exit. But there was nowhere to run. The wealthy elite of Atlanta had surrounded the VIP section, demanding answers, shouting insults, and blocking the aisles. The pristine, untouchable reputation my family had spent decades building was being ripped to shreds in front of my eyes. I stood calmly at the podium watching the empire burn. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. The numbers had told the story, and the truth was executing its own flawless revenge. The chaos in the ballroom had reached a deafening crescendo. Wealthy donors were shouting, demanding their money back, while my father frantically tried to shield himself from the very congregation he had manipulated for decades. I stood calmly at the podium watching the empire burn. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. The numbers had told the story, and the truth was executing its own flawless revenge. Suddenly, a sound even louder than the shouting crowd shattered the chaos. The massive brass doors at the main entrance of the ballroom were violently thrown open, slamming against the walls, with a force that actually shook the crystal chandeliers above. A booming voice cut through the air, commanding absolute authority. "Federal agents, nobody move." The entire ballroom froze. Dozens of men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs poured into the room. They were flanked by fully uniformed officers from the Atlanta Police Department. The sleek, high society charity gala was instantly transformed into an active federal crime scene. Heavy boots pounded against the polished marble floors as agents quickly moved to secure every single exit, their radios crackling with sharp professional commands. Special Agent Harrison led the primary entry team, his eyes scanning the terrified crowd before locking onto the VIP section at the front of the room. He pointed a steady finger directly at my brother-in-law. Trent Evans Harrison shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud, money laundering, and extortion. Get your hands where I can see them." Trent looked at the federal agents swarming the room, and then he looked up at the massive high-definition screen still displaying his offshore banking records. The arrogant, untouchable corporate titan completely vanished, replaced instantly by a terrified, cornered coward. He did not surrender. Driven by pure blind panic, Trent turned his back on the agents and bolted. He scrambled desperately over a linen-covered table, sending crystal champagne flutes and imported orchid centerpieces crashing to the floor, sprinting frantically toward the narrow catering exit behind the stage. He barely made it 5 steps. 2 massive federal agents lunged forward, tackling Trent with a brutal, uncompromising force. The heavy impact of their bodies hitting the hardwood floor sent a sickening thud echoing through the silent room. Trent screamed in shock and pain as the agents forcefully pinned his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the final gavel dropping on his miserable life. Get off me! Trent sobbed, his face pressed painfully against the floor, his expensive tailored suit torn at the shoulder. I did not do it alone. Silas told me to do it. He signed the transfers. It was his charity. The utter lack of loyalty was breathtaking. The moment the handcuffs clicked, the fragile alliance of my toxic family completely dissolved. Trent was already singing to the authorities, perfectly willing to throw his father-in-law into the federal furnace to save his own skin. Chloe let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She dropped to her knees right in the middle of the shattered glass and ruined flowers, her hands covering her face. Her perfect red designer dress dragged in the spilled wine on the floor. She looked up and saw me standing calmly at the edge of the stage, looking down at the wreckage. Chloe scrambled forward on her hands and knees, tears streaming down her face, entirely abandoning her pride. She grabbed the edge of the wooden stage, her knuckles turning white. Dominique, please, Chloe begged, her voice raw and utterly pathetic. Please tell them to stop. Tell them it is a mistake. You have the money. You have the trust fund. You won. Just drop the charges. We are family, Dominique. You cannot send my husband to prison. We are your blood. I looked down at the sister who had spent her entire life trying to make me feel small. The sister who had mocked my grief, who had brought armed men into my home, and who had gleefully planned to throw me out onto the street. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No pity, no anger, just a cold, empty finality. I slowly walked down the wooden steps of the stage, my midnight black silk gown gliding silently over the floor. I stopped right in front of her, forcing her to look up into my eyes. Family does not steal from each other while the grave is still fresh, Chloe. I said, my voice perfectly steady and loud enough for the federal agent standing nearby to hear. Family does not use a funeral as an opportunity to rob a widow. You made your choice when you brought those men into my home. Your family ended the exact moment you walked into my bedroom and stole Julian's anniversary painting right off my wall. Chloe gasped, choking on her own tears, as the devastating reality of my words hit her. I turned my back on her and walked away, leaving her weeping bitterly on the floor. Special Agent Harrison had already moved on to the VIP table. My father, Pastor Silas, was standing rigidly behind his chair, his face pale and sweating profusely. He raised his hands, trying to use the deep, booming voice he relied on to control his congregation. Officers, there has been a terrible misunderstanding, Silas said, attempting a smile that looked more like a grimace. I am a man of God. This charity is a pillar of the Atlanta community. I simply entrusted the finances to my son-in-law. I had no knowledge of any illicit activities. Harrison did not even blink. He pulled a thick stack of printed documents from his jacket pocket. It was the heavily encrypted dossier I had given him at the diner. Save the sermon for the judge, Silas Harrison said coldly. We have the internal routing numbers. We have the forged consulting invoices bearing your direct signature. You authorized the transfer of $2 million into a Delaware shell company to pay off an organized crime syndicate. You are under arrest for embezzlement and federal racketeering. Harrison signaled to a uniformed officer who firmly grabbed my father's arms and pulled them behind his back. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around my father's wrists. The wealthy donors, the city council members, and the real estate moguls watched in absolute stunned silence as the untouchable holy patriarch of their community was paraded out of his own gala like a common street criminal. The fake empire of righteous perfection was completely, irreversibly destroyed. Seeing her husband in handcuffs and her golden son-in-law pinned to the floor, my mother Vivian finally broke. The sheer, overwhelming reality of her new life, a life devoid of stolen wealth, stripped of high society status, and facing total public ruin, crashed down upon her. She let out a dramatic, breathless wail, clutched her chest with both hands, and dramatically swooned backward. She clearly expected one of her wealthy socialite friends to catch her. Instead, the women she had spent years gossiping with simply took a step back in disgust. Vivian collapsed onto the marble floor with a heavy thud, the stolen diamond tennis necklace glittering mockingly against her neck. Paramedics were immediately called into the room by the police, but it was incredibly obvious to everyone watching that her fainting spell was nothing more than a desperate theatrical attempt to escape the crushing humiliation of the moment. I stood near the center aisle watching the authorities clean up the trash. Trent was dragged to his feet, still crying and screaming accusations at my father as he was marched out the side doors. Silas walked with his head hung in absolute shame, refusing to look at the angry faces of the donors he had betrayed. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside illuminated the glass foyer, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the ballroom. My work here was completely finished. The ledger was finally balanced. I turned and began to walk toward the main exit. As I moved down the center aisle, the crowd of wealthy guests instinctively parted for me. They stepped back, opening a wide, clear path. There were no more patronizing smiles. There were no more whispers about the disgraced, helpless widow. They looked at me with a profound mixture of absolute awe and genuine fear. They realized that the quiet woman they had previously ignored was the most dangerous person in the room. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the convention center and stepped out into the warm, humid night. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles painted the streets, but I completely ignored the commotion. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, fresh air of Atlanta. For the very first time in my entire life, I felt completely weightless. The suffocating expectations of my toxic family were gone. The crushing, manipulative guilt they used to control me had been permanently severed. The young valet, looking thoroughly intimidated by the massive police presence, hurried over and handed me the keys to the black Porsche. I offered him a polite nod and a crisp $100 bill, the exact same bill my mother had thrown at me in the church pew last Sunday. I opened the heavy door of the sports car and slid down into the premium leather seat. I fastened my seatbelt and pushed the silver ignition button. The twin-turbo engine roared to life, a deep, powerful sound that vibrated through my very bones. I gripped the steering wheel, looking out through the windshield at the glittering city skyline stretched out before me. A genuine, radiant smile broke across my face, wiping away the cold, calculating mask I had worn all week. Julian was gone, but the immense strength and the unyielding truth he had nurtured inside me were going to live on forever. I shifted the car into gear, pressed my foot firmly against the accelerator, and drove out into the beautiful, limitless night, leaving the ashes of my family's empire far behind me in the rearview mirror. The greatest lesson here is that sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to disrespect your boundaries or steal your peace. Toxic relatives will often use guilt and tradition to keep you small. They expect you to crumble when they attack. But true power comes from quiet preparation and absolute financial independence. You do not have to scream to be heard. Let them underestimate you. Let them dig their own graves with their greed. When you stand firmly in your truth and hold the receipts, you never have to play the victim. You just balance the ledger. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your peace? Tell me your story in the comments below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering journeys.